Nobody in Cedar Fork could tell you exactly what happened up on that mountain in the winter of 1884. That was the whole point of Daniel Grant. He had arranged his life so carefully over so many years that nobody could tell you much of anything about him at all. He had built his cabin 4,000 feet above the last road anyone bothered to name up in a cold fold of the Winter Range where the spruce grew so thick the sky came to you only in pieces. The nearest trading post was a half-day's ride down a trail that vanished clean under the first real snow of October, and the snow always came early up there. Always. People in Cedar Fork would see him once a month, maybe less. He would load salt and coffee and rifle cartridges into his pack without speaking to anyone who didn't speak to him first. He would nod once at Elias Croft behind the trading post counter. Then he would ride back up the mountain and disappear into the tree line, and the town would go on without him. Nobody went up after him. Not the curious ones, not the concerned ones, not the ones who thought a man living alone that long must need something. They tried in the early years. They came back quiet. But there is one thing the old-timers in Cedar Fork will tell you if you find them on the right evening with a fire going and something warm in their hands. They will tell you that in all the years Daniel Grant lived on that mountain, only one person climbed up and never came back down for good. And if you ask them how that started, they get quiet for a moment. Then they say it started with boot prints in the snow. The morning it began, Daniel Grant was already 2 miles into his eastern trap line before the sun cleared the ridge. He moved through the spruce and pine without a sound. Not because he was trying to, simply because a man who spends enough years in country like this either learns that silence is a condition like altitude, like cold, or he doesn't last long enough to argue about it. Daniel had long since stopped trying. He had simply become it. His breath came out in short white clouds. The temperature had dropped hard overnight, harder than the previous week. He could read it in the snow beneath his boots, dry, fine-grained, not packing. That kind of snow meant the cold had settled in for a real stay, not a visit, a residency. He was wearing the elk-hide coat he had made 8 years ago, dark with weather and use. His rifle rode across his back. His hands worked the traps with the calm efficiency of a man who has performed the same motions so many thousands of times they no longer require thought. Find the trap, check the catch, reset, move on. 2 marten in the first 3 traps. Good. A beaver sign near the 4th location suggested he should adjust the set tomorrow. He was resetting the 4th trap when he stopped. He stopped the way a man stops when something that is not supposed to be there is there anyway, completely without drama, all his attention shifting to one point. Boot prints in the snow, small ones, fresh ones, cutting across the trail from the south, heading uphill toward the cabin. Daniel crouched down and looked at them properly. A woman's boot, narrow heel, shorter stride than a man's. The right heel dragged in 3 separate places where the snow was deeper. The gait was uneven. She had been tired or cold or hurt or all 3 together. And the prints were recent. The fine, dry snow hadn't yet filled the edges. 2 hours, maybe less. He looked up the trail, then back down. She had stopped twice. He could read it in the snow, the small disturbances where she had turned and looked back the way she had come. Both times she had turned around again and kept climbing. Whatever was below her was worse than the unknown above. Daniel picked up his pack. He followed the tracks. He found her 40 yards from the cabin in the shelter of a wide spruce stand where the snow was thinner. She had not made it to the door. She was sitting with her back against the widest trunk, knees pulled up, arms folded hard across her chest. A leather traveling bag sat in the snow beside her, and one gloved hand was still gripping the handle. She had decided at some point not to let go of it. Whatever else she lost on the way up this mountain, she had kept hold of that bag. Her coat was dark wool, decent quality once, but it was made for cities, not altitude. Her hat had come off somewhere back down the trail. It was sitting in the snow 3 feet away, as if she had simply stopped caring about it when other things became more urgent. Her dark hair had come loose and lay in damp strands against her face. Her face was white. Not pale. White. The particular white of someone who has used everything they had and is now running on the last reserve that the body keeps for emergencies. She opened her eyes when she heard him stop in the trees, and she looked at him directly, steadily, with dark eyes that did not flinch. She did not scream. He gave her full credit for that. "Mr. Grant," she said. Her voice was rough and thin from cold and 3 weeks of hard travel, but it was level. Daniel said nothing. He was still reading the situation the way he read every situation, all available information gathered before any decision was made. "You are Daniel Grant," she said again. Not a question this time. A statement she needed confirmed before she could let herself stop holding on quite so hard. "I am," he said. Something went out of her then. Not strength, not yet, but the extreme focused tension of a person who has been keeping themselves together across an impossible distance and has just found a surface solid enough to lean against even temporarily, even if the surface was a stranger standing in the trees of a mountain she had never seen before yesterday. "My name is Clara Ashford," she said. "I believe I have something of yours, a letter." He helped her to her feet. She did not ask for help, and she did not thank him for it, which he noted. She was unsteady. Her feet had gone past cold into the early stages of numbness. He could tell by the way she placed them, testing each step slightly before committing. But she stood, and she stayed standing. She reached into her coat and pulled out an envelope. The paper was stained and creased from weeks of handling. She held it out to him. He took it. He stood there in the snow between the spruce trees and read it. A formal letter. Careful, practiced handwriting. His name at the bottom, Daniel Grant, written in a script he would have known anywhere in the world. He had not written it. He read it a second time, slowly and completely. The letter described a capable man living in the Utah Territory. A cabin. Hard work, honest living, frontier conditions. It described a man seeking a woman of good character for the purpose of marriage and companionship. It described a man who had paid the passage fees and was expecting her. Every word of it was a lie. Every word of it was written in the handwriting of a man Daniel had known for nearly 30 years. He folded the letter. He looked at Clara Ashford. She was watching him the way a person watches when they have already begun to suspect the answer and are steeling themselves for the confirmation. "I didn't write this," he said. She held his eyes for a long moment, 3 full seconds. Then she looked away, just briefly, just long enough for something to move across her face, something she pushed back below the surface almost immediately. "I see," she said. 2 words, completely hollow. The voice of a woman doing the arithmetic very fast and finding the numbers ruinous. "I left everything," she said quietly, half to herself. "My position, my room, the last of what I had saved. The agency told me it was all arranged, that you had paid, that there was a house waiting." She stopped. She drew a slow breath. "I have been traveling for 23 days. Daniel said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. She straightened her shoulders. He watched her do it. Watched the deliberate physical act, the small architecture of a woman rebuilding her bearing after a blow. She had done this before, many times. "I apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Grant," she said. "I will find my way back to—" "You won't," he said. She stopped. He looked northwest. The clouds above the ridge had gone the wrong shade of gray. Not the ordinary gray of winter overcast, the deeper, heavier gray of a sky that has been loading for days and has finally decided to unburden itself. He had seen that sky 100 times. He knew exactly what came with it. "Storm moving in," he said. "It will be here within the hour. You won't make it back to town before it hits." "I'll manage," she said. "No," he said. "You won't." He said it without cruelty, the way a man states a temperature or a trail condition, as simple fact. The temperature will drop 30 degrees before midnight. You don't know this trail in the dark. You don't know what that kind of cold does to a person who has already used up everything they had. She looked at the trail below her. She looked at the sky. He could see her calculating and the numbers coming up wrong no matter how she arranged them. "I won't impose on you," she said. "Already imposed," he said. "Nothing to be done about that now." He bent and picked up her traveling bag from the snow. He turned and walked toward the cabin. He did not look back. He did not tell her to follow. He did not offer a hand or an invitation. He simply walked. Behind him, after a moment, he heard her footsteps in the snow. The cabin sat in a clearing just below the ridge, sheltered on three sides by old-growth timber, stone chimney, woodpiles stacked 8 cords deep on the east wall out of the prevailing wind. The log walls had been hand-cut and hand-fitted, seasoned to a deep silver gray. A person could see if they looked at it honestly that this structure had been built by a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had taken the time to do it right. Clara stopped for a moment when she saw it. Just a moment, then she followed him inside. The first thing Clara noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a home where someone had chosen stillness. Not the comfortable hush of a place between activity. This was something different. This was the silence of a place that had been stripped to its essential working parts and nothing more. A silence that had been there so long it had stopped being an absence and had become a presence of its own. Resident in the corners settled into the wood. She read the main room the way she had learned to read every room she had ever entered, quickly and thoroughly. Cast iron stove in the center burning steady. A work table against the north wall, dark with years of use, its surface marked with the specific scars of a man who worked with sharp tools and heavy loads. A wooden chair by the window. A bunk in the far corner. A larger armchair near the stove, worn into the precise shape of the man who sat in it, the particular compression of a single body, a single posture over a very long time. Traps hung along a crossbeam in order of size, pelts stretched and drying on the south wall. A trapline map tacked up with iron nails, a rifle on pegs beside the door, clean and ready. No curtains, no rugs, no pictures, no books on the shelves, not a single object whose purpose was beauty or comfort or memory. Everything present had a function. Nothing was present for any other reason. This was not a home. This was a working station for one man's survival. And then Clara saw the cup. In the far corner of the shelf above the stove, set slightly apart from the tin cups and the coffee tin and the salt, a single ceramic cup, pale blue, a different age and origin from everything else in the room. There was no dust on it. Someone tended to it regularly, but it had clearly not been used in a very long time. It sat there the way a kept promise sits, honored but not touched. Clara looked at it for one careful moment. Then she looked away and did not look at it again. Daniel moved through the cabin without looking at her. He stirred the stove, added wood-pumped water into the kettle. Each movement connected to the next without pause. The cabin was already warm. He had banked the fire before leaving this morning, as he always did, because the mountain did not forgive the man who came back to a cold cabin in winter. "Spare room through there?" he said, nodding toward the inner door. "Door locks from the inside. Clean linens on the bunk." "Thank you," Clara said. "Stew in an hour." She went through the door he indicated and pulled it closed behind her. The room was small and clean. A narrow bunk, a wooden chair, a single north-facing window looking into the forest, a basin and pitcher on a low table. And at the foot of the bunk, a folded blanket. Heavy wool, dark green, new. The fold lines were still sharp. She picked it up, felt the weight of it, set it down. Someone had bought this blanket and put it here. Not yesterday. It had been here longer than she had. It had been waiting here. She went to the window and looked at the trees, while the sky outside moved from gray to the dark iron color of a serious storm. She stood there until Daniel called through the door that supper was ready. She came out and sat down across from him at the rough table. The stew was simple beef and root vegetables and salt and nothing extra. But she had been on railroad rations for 3 weeks, carefully portioning out what she could afford, and the smell of it alone was enough to loosen something tight in her chest. She ate without speaking, with her full attention on the bowl. When she looked up, he was watching her, not with any particular expression, just with that steady, categorizing attention, the look of a man who reads the world carefully before he responds to it. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" he asked. "Yesterday morning," she said. "Some bread." He stood without comment and ladled more stew into her bowl. She did not thank him. There was something in the gesture that was beyond thanks, something she would have disrupted by naming it. So she picked up her spoon and ate the second helping as she had eaten the first. After supper she offered to do the dishes. He refused. "You've been traveling for weeks," he said. "Rest." "I won't sit idle while I'm eating your food," she said. "Then don't sit idle. Go to sleep." "I'm not tired enough yet," she said. That was a lie. She was exhausted to the marrow, but the alternative was to sit still in this strange, stripped-down room with this quiet, unreadable man, and she had found long ago that stillness without purpose was harder to manage than work. So she went to the pump and basin and began washing the bowls. Daniel watched her for a moment. Then he went to the work table and sat down with a length of leather harness that needed repair. The wind outside was building now. Clara could hear it through the log walls, low and sustained, beginning to do the mountain's business. The stove ticked. The lamp threw a steady amber circle across half the room and left the rest in shadow. It was during this silence that she noticed the trap cords. They were hanging on a hook beside the door, a coiled length of heavy braided leather used for something in the trapline operation. She didn't know exactly what, but she could see what was happening to the lower third of the braid. The fibers had worn through in a slow diagonal, not broken, not yet, but fraying in the specific way that meant failure was coming and coming at the worst possible moment in the field in the cold, when the failure would cost more than just the cord. She dried her hands. She went to her traveling bag and found her sewing kit, her heaviest needles and the thick linen thread she used for canvas work and winter coat repair. She took the cords down from the hook. Daniel looked up from his harness. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. She sat down and laid the cords across her knees, studying the damage. "But this is going to fail on you, probably in weather worse than this. I would have gotten to it. Now you won't have to." She examined the weave pattern for a moment, working out how it had been constructed and therefore how it needed to be reinforced. The technique was unfamiliar, but the principle was the same as any repair. You had to understand the original before you could restore it. "You don't know what those are," he said. "No," she agreed, threading her needle. "But I know what a worn braid looks like, and I know how to fix one." He looked at her for a moment, then turned back to his harness. She worked steadily. The wind pressed against the walls. The fire held. Outside, the first snow of the real storm began to hit the shuttered windows in a soft, steady hiss. When she finished, the repair was tighter than the original construction. She hung the cords back on their hook and went to bed without mentioning it. But in the morning, when she came out to start the coffee, she noticed that the cords had been taken down, examined and rehung at a slightly different angle. The angle of a man who has tested a repair and found it sound. The storm arrived in full before midnight. Clara lay in the bunk and listened to it come. First the wind climbing in pitch and volume until it was pressing against the cabin walls with real intention. Then the snow, fine and hard, hissing against the shuttered windows. Then a deep concussive boom from the ridge above, not thunder, just air and elevation doing what they did up here when they decided to. The cabin held. It held with the solidity of something built by a man who had thought carefully about every joint and every wall because he knew exactly what this mountain could send at him. From the other side of the wall she heard Daniel moving through the main room. Not pacing, not worried, just the specific sounds of a nightly routine. The stove checked the door, tested the shutters, confirmed. She had heard him do these same checks before she fell asleep the previous night in exactly the same order. He was counting on the predictability of the check, on the knowledge that if everything was in its proper state, the night would be manageable. She understood that impulse entirely. After a while the sounds stopped. The only things left were the storm and the slow ticking of the stove and the deep old silence of the mountain underneath everything. She pulled the green wool blanket to her chin and lay in the dark. She thought about the forged letter in her coat pocket. She thought about the handwriting, practiced, careful, intended to deceive. Someone had spent time on those letters, the exchange of them over months. Someone who knew this man well enough to write as him convincingly. She thought about the second envelope she carried, the one she had not shown him, the one from the return address in St. Louis that she had recognized the moment it arrived at the boarding house 3 weeks ago, the morning before she left. She had not opened it. She pressed it to the back of her mind and let the storm take her into sleep. In the morning the world had been remade in white. 3 feet of new snow. The storm had been thorough and complete the way mountain storms were up here, not interested in being half measures. Clara stood at the window and looked out at a landscape so still and white it seemed to have erased its own geography. She dressed. She came out into the main room. Daniel was not there. The stove was burning. He had been up long before her and added fuel. The kettle was hot on the back plate. And there on the floor beside the stove, moved with great care from where she had left them by the door, were her boots, placed close enough to the stove to have dried and warmed through, not so close as to crack the leather. Clara stood and looked at her boots. She did not call out or comment. She simply picked them up, warm, dry, completely ready, and sat in the chair nearest the stove and put them on. The door opened and Daniel came in from his morning rounds, stomping snow from his own boots. He glanced at her in his brief, functional way, checking conditions, noting status, and crossed to the kettle. "Road's gone," he said. 3 feet of new snow. The south trail won't be passable for at least 2 days, probably 3. "All right," Clara said. He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking whether she wanted one, set one at her place, sat down across from her with the trap-line log and a stub of pencil. Clara wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the window. The snow outside was still and perfect and utterly indifferent to the plans of the people inside. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked. He looked up, not surprised by the question, briefly surprised perhaps that someone was asking it. 12 years, he said. "Alone the whole time?" "Yes." She nodded and looked at her coffee. She did not push further. She had learned early in life that the most useful thing you could do in a new situation was listen more than you spoke. People told you what you needed to know if you gave them enough quiet to fill. She drank her coffee. 12 years. Alone. 4,000 feet above the nearest person who might notice if something went wrong. And that pale blue cup on the shelf that no one touched and no one explained. She filed it all away and said nothing more. The second day found its rhythm. Daniel went out to run the closer sections of his trap line, the loops he could complete, and return from before the afternoon light failed. Clara stayed in the cabin. She cleaned the floor. She reorganized the shelf above the stove, not rearranging his system, just making the existing one legible to anyone other than him. She found a stiff hinge on the inner door and worked it loose with the lamp oil. She mended the last 2 items from the pile in the corner. She did all of this without announcing it. When Daniel came back in that evening, he moved through the cabin with his usual efficiency. He took off his coat. He checked the stove temperature. He poured water from the pump, and the pump ran freely, smooth and immediate where there had been a slight catch in the mechanism the day before. He worked the handle twice, looked at it, looked across the room at Clara, who was sitting at the table with her needles and thread, and the last of his torn shirts. He said nothing for a moment. "The pump was stiff," he said. "It was," she said without looking up. "I would have gotten to it." "I know," she said. "Now you won't have to." He looked at the pump for one more moment. Then he turned to the stove and poured himself coffee and said nothing else about it. The stove lesson happened near the end of that second afternoon. Clara had managed the fire well enough through both days, but the mountain cold worked differently than anything she had dealt with before. The dry air at altitude made the wood burn faster than it seemed like it should, and there was a particular drop in temperature that came in the late afternoon, sudden and severe, that required a specific adjustment in the damper, or the heat would bleed off faster than the fire could replace it. She had nearly lost it once mid-afternoon of the second day. Caught it in time, but only barely. Daniel showed her that evening. He came and stood beside her at the stove and pointed the size of wood for banking the long hours, the precise damper position for holding heat through a cold night, the sound the draw made when the balance was correct. A low, steady pull, not the irregular flutter of a draft fighting itself. He explained it once completely and stepped back. Clara listened with the full attention of a woman who understood that this was not social conversation. This was information she needed in order to be safe in this place. So she listened, the way she listened to things that mattered. "What happens if it goes out in the night?" she asked. "Cold reaches you faster than you'd think," he said. "At this altitude you have maybe 2 hours before it gets dangerous, less if the wind is running." "Then I won't let it go out," she said. He looked at her with a brief, specific attention. Not warm, not cold, just precise. "Fuel log is on the shelf," he said. "Mark every addition with the time and the size of the piece. That way I know what the cabin used while I was out." He showed her the small tally book, years of daily entries in the same hand, the same format. Temperature at dawn. Fuel added. Weather conditions noted. The record of a man who managed his life the way he managed his trapline, methodically, without sentiment, with everything accounted for. She picked up the book and looked at it carefully. Then she put it back exactly where he had taken it from. "All right," she said. He nodded once, turned back to his work. She watched his back for a moment. The broad shoulders, the unhurried movement, the particular economy of a man who had spent years alone and had learned to rely on nothing but his own competence. She had met men like this before, self-sufficient to the point of invisibility, as if they had decided at some point that needing things was a vulnerability they could not afford. She recognized the shape of that decision. She had made versions of it herself. On the evening of the second day, Daniel noticed something about her. Not the work she was doing. He had already catalogued that. What he noticed was subtler and older than the mended shirts and the freed pump. He noticed the way she moved through the space. She was always conscious of where he was. She always left him a clear path to the door. She never placed herself between him and the exit without immediately stepping aside. When he came in from outside, she moved back before he asked her to. When she sat at the table, she chose the seat against the wall, not the center of the room. She made herself small in the cabin without appearing to try. She ate less than what he put in front of her. She spoke less than she clearly had thoughts worth saying. These were not the habits of shyness or deference. They were the habits of a woman who had spent years in situations where making herself less was the thing that kept her safe. He knew what that kind of survival looked like. He recognized the marks of it the way you recognize a weather pattern you have seen before, not because you enjoy seeing it, but because you have learned to read it accurately. He did not say anything about it. But that night when he ladled the stew, he put more in her bowl than in his own. And he watched without appearing to watch as she noticed. As she looked at the fuller bowl for just a moment before picking up her spoon, she did not comment. She did not protest. She simply ate. He took that as the beginning of something. He was not yet sure what. On the morning of the third day, the coffee was already made when Daniel came in from the early check. Clara was sitting at the table with her book, a small volume she had taken from her traveling bag, worn at the binding from long use. She looked up when he came in. His cup was at his place, steam rising from it. He sat down. He drank his coffee. He opened the trapline log. After a while, "The letter," Clara said. He looked up. "You know who wrote it," she said. "You recognized the handwriting." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow had stopped and the mountain was very still. "Man named Elias Croft," he said. "Runs the trading post in Cedar Fork. We served together in the war. He has been on me for years to stop living the way I live. So he thought sending a woman up here would fix it, apparently." Clara turned this over. He watched her think carefully without rushing to a conclusion. "He paid the placement fee himself," she said. "So my money went where it was supposed to go." "That's what it looks like." "But he still forged your name. He still sent me here on a lie." "Yes." A long pause. She looked at her book without reading it. "He thought he was helping you," she said. It was not an excuse. It was just an observation stated plainly. "He always does," Daniel said. And there was something in those three words, not quite anger, not quite grief, not quite forgiveness, that was older and more complicated than any of those things on its own. Clara set her cup down. She reached into her coat, which was hanging by the door on the hook above the repaired trap cords. She pulled out a second envelope, smaller than the letter, worn at the edges in the way of something carried for a long time. She turned it over in her hands. Then she pressed it back into the coat pocket without opening it. She came back to the table and sat down. Daniel had watched all of this. He did not ask about the envelope. "I'll need to speak with Elias Croft," Clara said, "when the road opens." "So will I," Daniel said. "And after that—" He looked at her across the table. She met his eyes without flinching. "After that, we figure out what comes next," he said. She nodded once. She picked up her book and opened it to the page she had marked with a folded corner. The mountain held its enormous silence around them. The fire held. That evening, Clara was reading by the lamp when Daniel, sitting across the room with a piece of leather and his shaping tools, looked up and saw the book in her hands. He had noticed it before. a small volume, cloth-bound, the kind that fit in a coat pocket. She read it in the evenings quietly, her lips moving slightly now and then. He looked at it for a moment. Then he stood, crossed the room, and picked it up from the table gently because she had marked her place and he didn't want to lose it. He turned it over and read the cover. Poetry. A woman's name he recognized distantly from somewhere. Elizabeth Barrett Browning. He opened it to the first page. Read the first 4 lines. He set it down. Clara was watching him with an expression that was nearly, not quite, amusement, the careful, controlled version of amusement that belongs to people who have learned not to show too much. "You read poetry," he said. "Apparently." "I don't," he said. "I know," she said. "You picked it up anyway." He looked at the book again. He picked it up once more and read further into the first poem. His lips moved slightly over a line that surprised him. He set it down again. "Why do you read her?" he asked. "Because she's honest," Clara said, "and because people always think she's only sad. But she's not. She's funny sometimes, and sharp." She paused. "She lost a great deal before the part of her life that most people know about." "Most people do," he said. It came out quieter than he intended. He turned back to his work table. Clara looked at the lamp for a moment. Then she picked up the book and resumed reading. Neither of them spoke again before bed. But Daniel lay in his bunk that night and thought about those 4 lines, about the weight in them, about how someone could write a thing that clean and that precise about loss without it breaking the sentence. He thought about it for longer than he expected to. On the morning of this 4th day, a sound came that Clara had not heard since arriving. Nothing dramatic, just different. The wind had shifted, coming now from the south, warmer by a few degrees, and the light through the window was brighter, more direct, the quality that meant the clouds were lifting. She was at the stove when Daniel came in from the early check. She had been managing the fire since before dawn without losing it once. The kettle was hot. He stood in the doorway and looked at the sky for a moment. Then he came inside. "South Trail will be passable tomorrow afternoon," he said. "Morning after that for certain." Clara poured his coffee and set it at his place. "All right," she said. He sat down. He looked at the fuel log she had made her entries as he'd asked date and time and piece size, the handwriting neat and consistent. He turned one page back to his own last entry, then forward to hers. He read through them without expression. "You kept the fire all night," he said. "I told you I would," she said. He closed the log and set it back on the shelf. Outside, the mountain was shifting toward thaw. The deep blue shadows of the spruce trees were sharpening in the stronger light. Somewhere far up the ridge a jay called once and was answered. Clara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and looked at the south window. She thought about Cedar Fork. She thought about Elias Croft and the letter she had carried for 23 days. She thought about the conversation that was coming, the one where things would be said that couldn't be unsaid, and decisions would have to be made that she did not yet know how to make. And she thought briefly about the second envelope in her coat pocket, the one she had not opened. The return address she had recognized immediately. The timing of it arriving 3 weeks ago, the morning before she left, as if someone had known she was about to go somewhere they couldn't easily reach her. She pressed that thought down, one thing at a time. "Mr. Grant," she said. He looked up. "When we go down to Cedar Fork," she said, "I'd like to come with you when you speak to Elias Croft." He looked at her steadily. "Why?" "Because whatever was done to both of us," she said. "And I'd like to hear it explained to my face, not to yours." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned back to his trapline log. "Suit yourself," he said. It was not enthusiasm. It was not rejection. It was simply acknowledgement. A door left open. Clara turned back to the south window and the brightening mountain and the long road that was waiting for the snow to give way. She would be ready. The south trail opened on the afternoon of the 5th day. Not fully, not the kind of open that invited confidence, but passable. The snow compacted enough under its own weight that a horse could manage the descent without losing the trail entirely. Daniel checked it at midday, came back and said 4 words. "We can go tomorrow." Clara was at the table with the trapline log. She had taken to recording weather observations in the margin temperature at dawn cloud direction. The particular quality of morning light that Daniel had explained meant precipitation coming or going. She was building a vocabulary for a place she had not planned to know this well. She looked up. "What time?" "Before first light," he said. "We want to be in Cedar Fork and back before afternoon. Weather turns fast this time of year." "I'll be ready," she said. He hung up his coat. He looked at the log in her hands for a moment. "You don't need to keep doing that," he said. "I know," she said, "but it's useful to track. I've been tracking it for 12 years without help." "Then you'll have 12 years plus a margin note," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with that flat, evaluating expression she was beginning to understand was not coldness. It was simply the face of a man who was always genuinely deciding what he thought rather than performing the reaction he was expected to have. He sat down and poured his coffee and said nothing more about the log. They left before dawn. The trail down was slow and required attention. The snow had frozen overnight into an irregular crust that caught the horses' feet unpredictably. Daniel rode ahead on his gelding, a dark bay compact and sure-footed, and completely unimpressed by difficulty, and Clara followed on the smaller mare he kept for pack work, borrowing his spare riding coat because her own was built for station platforms and city streets, not a mountain descent in January pre-dawn. She did not complain about the coat. She did not comment on the cold or the difficulty of the trail. She rode with both hands steady on the reins and her eyes on the path and kept pace without being asked to. Daniel did not look back to check on her. He had established this by the first switchback. If she fell behind, he would know from the sound of her horse. She was managing. He could read that from the rhythm of hoofbeats behind him even in the dark. Cedar Fork appeared below them as the sky lightened, a scatter of lamplight and wood smoke in the valley, small and orderly and entirely different in character from the country above it. Clara had not seen it properly on her way through 3 weeks ago. She had arrived by stage exhausted and disoriented, and had seen only the necessary things: the livery, the man who gave her directions to the trail, the particular quality of light that meant she needed to start climbing before it failed. Now, coming down from above in the cold, clear air, she saw it whole. A proper street. A church, white-painted its small steeple catching the first edge of daylight. A schoolhouse. General goods. A hotel with a lamp burning in the front window. The necessary geography of a working frontier town, neither charming nor ugly, simply built for the purpose of keeping people alive in difficult country. Daniel rode directly to Croft's trading post without stopping anywhere else. The front door of this trading post was unlocked. A lamp burned inside, but when Daniel pushed through the door, the main room was empty. The counter clean. The shelves stocked. The stove warm. On the counter, held flat by a tin of tobacco placed precisely on the upper left corner, was a sealed envelope. His name on the front in the handwriting he had spent the last 5 days trying to decide how to feel about. Daniel stood and looked at it for a moment. From the back of the store a door opened. Martha Croft came through, a woman of 50, gray-haired and composed, with the expression of someone who has been waiting for this particular morning for a while and has decided to be practical about it. She looked at Daniel. She looked at Clara. She set 2 cups on the counter and poured coffee into both of them from the pot she was carrying. She did not say a single word. She went back through the door. Daniel picked up the envelope. He opened it and read the letter standing at the counter. Clara sat on the bench along the wall with her coffee and did not watch him read. The store was very quiet. Outside, Cedar Fork was waking up someone's dog, a wagon somewhere on the main street, the distant sound of a hammer already at work. The ordinary music of a town that had no idea what was happening inside the trading post. Daniel read the letter once. Then he stood still for a long time, which was different from reading. Clara turned the coffee cup in her hands and looked at the shelves of dry goods and waited. She had learned in the last 5 days that the most important thing she could give Daniel Grant was time. He was not a man who processed things quickly in the performance sense, who filled silence to demonstrate he was engaged. He processed things completely, and only then did he respond. Interrupting that was like pulling a knot tighter when you should be loosening it. So she waited. After a while he set the letter down on the counter. He stood with his hands flat on the worn wood and looked at nothing in particular. Then he picked up the letter again and turned and walked to the bench and sat down beside Clara and held it out. She read it. It was a long letter. Not what she had expected. Not an apology in the conventional sense, not the arranged guilty words of a man who had been caught and was managing the consequences. It was something older and harder than that. Elias Croft had written the history of a friendship the way a man writes when he believes the friendship may not survive what he has to say. He wrote about the war, about the specific night in the winter of 1864 when Daniel had taken a wound that should have killed him and had not, because Elias had sat beside him through a full night and the following day and refused to let the attending physician give up on him. About the promise he had made, keeping watch over his unconscious friend in the frozen dark. I won't leave you. Whatever happens, I won't leave you alone. He wrote about the 12 years since Margaret Lowe had died, about watching Daniel come down the mountain once a month for supplies and go back up again without a word more than necessary. About seeing across years a man becoming less a man and more a function, a mechanism built for surviving a country that no longer needed to be survived because the country had stopped being the obstacle. The obstacle was something else now, and it was inside and it was winning. He wrote, I did it wrong. I know I did it wrong. But Sam, I made you a promise, and I kept it the only way I knew how. Clara read to the last line. Then she folded the letter and held it for a moment before giving it back. He loves you, she said, the way a person loves when they don't know what else to do. Daniel took the letter. He looked at it once more. He had no right, he said. No, she agreed. What he did was wrong. Yes, you could have been seriously hurt, coming up that mountain in those conditions with no idea what you were walking into. Yes. He looked at her. There was something in his expression she had not seen before. Not quite anger, not quite grief, not quite the thing that lived below both of those. Something that had been held under a long time and was pressing against the surface. And you're defending him, he said. I'm not defending him, she said. I'm telling you what I see. What he did and why he did it are two separate things. They can both be true. He was quiet. Martha came through the door again with more coffee and a plate of biscuits placed both on the counter and went back without speaking. It was, Clara thought, one of the more generous acts of privacy she had ever witnessed. Daniel stood after a while. He picked up the letter and folded it and put it in his coat pocket. I need to get supplies before we go back up, he said. All right, Clara said. She watched him move to the shelves and begin pulling down the things he had come for: rifle cartridges, salt, a block of wax for boot sealing dried beans, moving through the familiar task with his familiar efficiency, but slower than usual. His hands were doing the work while his mind was somewhere else entirely. She picked up a biscuit and ate it and gave him the space to be somewhere else. They were 20 minutes from the trading post, halfway back up the south trail, when Daniel stopped. Clara pulled her mare up behind him. He had dismounted and was crouching in the snow off the right side of the trail, and even from horseback she could see what he was looking at. Boot prints. 2 sets heavy men's boots with the deep, regular tread of working gear, moving fast up a side trail that branched east toward the far end of the valley, and a 3rd set beside them, smaller, shorter stride, the right heel dragging slightly in the softer sections. Daniel read the 3 sets of prints for half a minute. He stood up. Stay here, he said. Where are you going? East Trail leads to the Brennan claim, Murphy homestead just past it. He checked his rifle. 3 people, 2 men moving fast, 1 being brought along. Clara looked at the 3rd set of prints, at the right heel, at the spacing that said, hurry without willingness. I'll come with you, she said. He looked at her. Something moved briefly in his expression, not refusal, not agreement. The calculation of a man deciding whether argument would cost more time than it was worth. Stay behind me, he said, and stay on the horse. He remounted and turned east. The Murphy homestead sat in a shallow hollow at the edge of the valley's eastern timber, sheltered from the worst of the wind, but low enough to catch the heavy snowfall from the peaks above. A single-room cabin smaller than Daniel's, a barn in better shape than the house, a chicken coop. 2 horses Clara did not recognize were tied at the hitching post outside. Daniel dismounted 50 yards out and tied his horse to a lodgepole pine. Clara did the same. He moved to the south wall of the cabin away from the window and looked at the two strange horses, then at the trail coming down from above. He went to the front of the cabin and knocked on the door. The door opened. Cole Hatch was a man of 43, broad and weathered, with small, pale eyes that had long practice calculating how much trouble something was going to cost him. Two other men were visible behind him in the cramped interior, and behind the stove, standing very still against the far wall with a canvas bag gripped in both hands and the expression of someone who had been standing exactly that still for a while now, was a young woman. She was young, 20 perhaps, with brown hair escaping from a braid, and eyes that were doing what Clara had done at the gate of a strange cabin, which was computing available options and finding very few of them. She already had her bag. She had decided before this door opened. Daniel looked at Hatch. He did not look at the men behind him. He did not reach for his rifle. He simply stood there. There are men who demonstrate what they are capable of, and there are men who simply are what they are in the way a mountain is what it is, not threatening, not performing, simply present in a way that changes the calculations of everyone in the room. Daniel Grant was the second kind. He had been the second kind since the war, and 12 years on a mountain had only made it more so. One of the men behind Hatch said something quietly. Hatch's eyes moved to him, then back to Daniel. "She came here on her own," Hatch said. "She was brought here by a letter written by someone who forged a man's name," Daniel said. His voice was entirely level. "Same as happened to me." A pause. "She's leaving now," Daniel said. "I'd appreciate it if the door stayed open while she does." Hatch looked at him for a long moment. He looked at the rifle on Daniel's back. He looked at the two men behind him and appeared to weigh something carefully. Then he stepped to the side. The young woman moved immediately. She had been ready. She crossed the floor and came through the door and did not look back at Cole Hatch or the men behind him. She looked at Daniel once, briefly assessing, and then at Clara on the horse in the yard. She looked at Clara the way a woman looks at another woman in the field. "Are you safe? Is this safe?" Clara met her eyes and nodded once. Small, definite. The young woman walked to Clara's horse and stood beside it. Daniel looked at Hatch one last time. "Mr. Murphy's homestead is a quarter-mile west of here," he said. "He'll be expecting no visitors today." He stepped back from the door and pulled it closed. He came to where the two women were standing. He looked at the young woman's bag, small, worn, everything she owned, and at the set of her jaw and the determined stillness of her face. "Are you Sarah Brennan?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Daniel Grant. My cabin is an hour up the mountain." He picked up her bag and tied it to the back of his saddle. "Can you ride?" "I'll manage," she said. He helped her up behind the saddle without ceremony. She gripped his coat and did not speak and did not look back as they rode west and then north and then up the long, pale trail toward the tree line. Clara rode beside them on the way up and watched Sarah Brennan the way she had learned to watch people who were holding themselves together across a crisis by not watching directly, by noting the small things, the grip on Daniel's coat, the way she held herself carefully upright as if she did not trust what would happen if she let herself slump. The same way Clara had gripped her traveling bag in the snow under the spruce tree. The same way she had stood at a fence post outside a stranger's cabin and recited her own name because she needed to hear that she still had one. When the cabin came into view through the trees, Daniel pulled up. The lamp was already lit inside. Clara had left it burning that morning without thinking, the way you leave a lamp for a place you are coming back to. She noticed this, the small automatic act of it. She filed it away. Daniel dismounted. He helped Sarah down. He carried her bag to the door. He opened the door. Clara came up behind them and put her hand on Sarah's arm briefly, not taking her inside, not leading her, just present. "Come in," Clara said. "It's warm." Sarah Brennan was 20 years old and had used up everything she had about 48 hours ago, the way Clara had used up everything she had 5 days before that, on a different mountain in a different storm. She sat at the table and drank the coffee Clara put in front of her and held the cup in both hands and did not speak for a while. That was fine. The cabin was good at silence. Clara sat across from her. Daniel had gone to tend the horses and would be back when he was back. The stove ticked. The mountain settled. After a while, Sarah set the cup down. She looked at the room, the pelts, the traps, the stripped-down functional order of everything, and then she looked at Clara. "You came the same way," she said. "More or less," Clara said. "On a letter." "On a letter." Sarah absorbed this. "And you stayed." "I stayed." "Why?" Clara looked at the window. Outside, the late afternoon light was beginning to go gold in the spruce trees. "The storm came the night I arrived. The road was gone. By the time the road came back, something else was happening." She paused. "I'm not entirely sure yet what it is, but it seemed like a reason to wait and find out." Sarah looked at her coffee. "I didn't even have the option of finding out. Hatch was—" She stopped. She turned the cup in her hands. "He wasn't what the letters said." "None of them were," Clara said. "The man who wrote those letters has been doing it for at least 2 years, using real names and real addresses, sending women to people who didn't know they were coming, or to people like Hatch who knew very well." Sarah's face went still in a particular way, the stillness of someone calculating the full scope of something and not liking the numbers. "How many women?" she said. "I don't know yet, but more than just the 2 of us." The door opened and Daniel came in. He took off his coat and hung it. He looked at the 2 women at the table and poured himself coffee and sat down at the work table. The 3 of them existed in the cabin's silence for a moment. Not uncomfortably, just finding the geometry of it. 3 bodies where there had been 2, where there had been 1 for 12 years before that. "You can sleep in the spare room," Daniel said to Sarah. "Miss Ashford will move her things to the—" "I'll take the floor," Clara said. Both of them looked at her. "It's fine," she said. "I've slept on worse." "You won't sleep on the floor of my cabin," Daniel said. There was no argument in his voice, just the flat certainty of a man who had decided something. "Then where—" "There's a second bunk in the storeroom. I'll clear it tonight." He stood and went to the storeroom door. The sound of things being moved, careful, methodical, making space where there had not been space. Sarah looked at Clara. "He's always like this." "I'm still learning what always looks like," Clara said. "But yes, I think so." Over the days that followed, the 3 of them found a rhythm. It was not easy. 3 people in a one-room cabin at 4,000 feet in January, 2 of them strangers to the mountain, and one of them, a man who had spent 12 years alone, easy, was never going to be part of it. But a rhythm is not the same as easy. A rhythm is just the thing that keeps happening because stopping it would cost more than continuing. Sarah was practical and unsentimental and knew how to work. She and Clara divided the domestic labor without discussing it, each taking up the parts that suited them without ceremony or negotiation. Clara managed the fire and the cooking and the mending. Sarah took the water and the woodpile and the chickens, which Daniel kept in a small coop off the back of the barn. Daniel watched all of this from his customary slight remove, the way he watched everything, not cold, not indifferent, just present at a measured distance that allowed him to observe without being observed in return. Or so he thought. Clara, from her own measured distance, watched him watch. On the 3rd evening with Sarah in the cabin, Clara found the book. She had gone to the shelf for the lamp oil. Daniel kept it on the 2nd shelf from the top beside the extra wicks. And beside the lamp oil, laid flat and pushed to the back as if half hidden and half forgotten, was a small book, cloth-bound, dark blue, faded at the corners. A woman's book, clearly the kind with decorative stitching on the cover that men did not generally choose for themselves. She took it down. On the inside cover, in handwriting she did not recognize a woman's hand. Educated and clear, someone had written, "For S, so he will have something worth reading when I am not there to read with him. M." The ink was old. The inscription had faded slightly at the edges. Clara stood with the book in her hands for a moment. She looked at the pale blue cup on the shelf above the stove. She looked at the hook beside the door, the one Daniel had installed 2 days ago at a height she could reach without stretching, which was not the height a man building something for himself would naturally choose. She placed the book back exactly where she had found it, pushed it gently to the same position. She took the lamp oil and went back to the table. She did not mention it. That night, after Sarah had gone to the storeroom, Daniel and Clara sat in the main room in the ordinary way they had developed, he at the work table, she at the table by the window. The stove was banked for the long night. The lamp burned low. Daniel had the book in his hands. She did not know when he had taken it from the shelf. She had not seen him do it, but he was sitting with it, not reading, just holding it the way you hold something that has weight beyond its physical weight, turning it over once, stopping. He set it on the table between them. "You saw it," he said, not a question. "Yes," she said, "and you didn't say anything." "It wasn't mine to say anything about." He looked at the cover. He looked at the inscription, which she had already read, though he didn't know that. "Her name was Margaret," he said. He said it the way a man says something he has not said out loud in a very long time, the way a word can almost lose its shape from disuse, and then when you finally make yourself say it, turn out to be exactly the shape it always was. "She died in 1871, he said, "before we married, before she ever saw this place." Clara looked at the book on the table. She did not look at him. Sometimes the kindest thing you can offer a person is a direction they can speak into that isn't your face. "She was a nurse," he said. "I met her in a field hospital in Virginia. I had a wound that had gone septic, and she was the one who stayed with me when they thought I wasn't going to last the night." He paused. "She stayed with me. And when I was well enough to be moved, I found out she had stayed for 3 days without proper sleep." Clara said nothing. "We wrote letters for 3 years after the war. I came west to build something worth bringing her to. I planned every inch of this place with her in mind." A long quiet. Then the letter came saying she was gone. "How long after you finished building?" 4 months. Clara finally looked at him. He was looking at the book. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was 12 years ago." "That doesn't change what it was." He was quiet for a while. The stove ticked its slow measured count. "I kept building things for her," he said almost to himself. "That hook by the door, the shelf at the right height, the window facing south. I kept building as if she might still arrive someday." He stopped. "I didn't realize I was still doing it until you pointed out that you could reach the hook." Clara was very still. "You noticed that," she said. "I did." He looked at her. "I don't know what to do with that, Miss Ashford." "Clara," she said. "You've called me that twice." "Clara," he said, as if testing whether it fit. "I don't know what to do with the fact that I'm still building a house for a woman who has been gone for 12 years. "Maybe you don't need to do anything with it yet," Clara said. "Maybe it's enough that you noticed." He looked at the book one more time. Then he picked it up, stood and carried it back to the shelf. He placed it face in, the way a person places something they are not ready to look at directly, but are not ready to put away either. He came back to the table. He sat down. He picked up the strip of harness leather he had been working on. After a while he said, "She would have liked you." Clara looked at her own hands. "She would have found me irritating," she said. "I rearrange things." He made a sound very small, barely audible. Not quite a laugh, but the closest thing to one she had heard from him. She picked up her sewing, and they worked in silence until the lamp ran low. Elias came up the mountain 6 days after the confrontation. He came alone on the smaller of his 2 horses, carrying provisions Clara had asked him to bring up from the trading post, extra flour coffee, a length of heavy canvas, a fresh tin of lamp oil. He tied up at the post outside and knocked once and waited. Clara opened the door. Elias Croft was a man of 44 silver at the temples, with the kind of face that had spent so long in open country it had arranged itself around weather and worry into something honest. He looked at Clara with the careful, direct expression of a man who has decided the best position available to him is honesty and is committed to it. "Miss Ashford," he said, "I'm glad you're still here." "Come in," she said. He came inside. Daniel was at the work table and looked up without expression when Elias entered, which told Clara exactly nothing, because Daniel looked up at most things without expression. But she watched the particular quality of that nothing, and understood that the conversation in the trading post had not been the end of something. It was the beginning of a longer process that 2 men who had known each other through a war were going to work through in the particular slow way that kind of friendship worked things through. Elias sat down. Clara put coffee in front of him. Sarah was outside with the chickens and would be back shortly. "There's something you need to know," Elias said. He said it to both of them, making no distinction. "About the agency." He laid it out plainly. the Western Hearts Matrimonial Agency in St. Louis, operating for at least 2 years. The pattern real names taken from frontier records, forged letters, agency fees collected from women who had no reason to doubt the correspondence. Sometimes the destination was a real man who had not requested a bride, a man like Daniel, and the woman arrived to find no arrangement waiting. Sometimes the destination was a man like Cole Hatch, who had paid a different kind of fee to receive a woman who had already spent everything she had to get there. The agency had been doing this across multiple territories. The number of women involved was not known, and the man who ran it, the name Elias, had uncovered through a contact in Salt Lake City who dealt in land records and territorial business filings, was Arthur Voss. Daniel heard the name and said nothing for a moment. Clara watched his face. Something happened behind his eyes, not recognition exactly, the recalibration of a man who already knew the name and was now placing it in a context that changed everything he thought he knew about how he had come to know it. "Voss," he said. "You know him," Elias said. "I served with him," Daniel said. "Same unit war. He was our troop sergeant for 2 years. A long quiet. "I trusted him behind me," Daniel said. The sentence had the weight of something that had once been simple and had become very complicated. "He came back from the war with nothing," Elias said. "No land, no money, no family. Apparently this was what he found." Daniel stood up. He went to the window. He looked at the mountain. Clara looked at Elias. She said, "What do you need from us?" Elias looked at her with something in his face that was somewhere between surprise and gratitude. "A letter," he said. 2, ideally. Signed testimonies from women who were directly deceived by the agency, with specific details, dates, amounts, correspondence. Those are what the territorial authorities need to move on this. He paused. "And there is another woman. Her name is Sarah Brennan." "She is in my barn," Daniel said without turning from the window. Elias blinked. "She arrived 4 days ago," Daniel said. "I brought her down from the Hatch place." Elias closed his eyes briefly. "Is she all right?" "She will be," Daniel said. "When you go back down, she goes with you. Martha will take her in until she knows what she wants to do next." It was not a question. Elias nodded. "Of course." "And Elias." Daniel turned from the window. His voice was level and specific the way it was when he had thought something through to its conclusion and arrived at a position. "When I come down next week, you and I will finish the conversation we started." "I know," Elias said. "You did something wrong." "I know that too. We're not done with it yet." "No," Elias agreed. "But Sam, look at who's sitting at that table." Daniel looked. Clara was already writing. She had found paper in the storage shelf and had Daniel's good pen in hand and was setting down in her clear, careful script the beginning of a testimony that was going to be very difficult for anyone to dismiss. She did not look up. Daniel turned back to the window. The letters took 2 evenings to write properly. Clara drafted them with the thoroughness of a woman who had spent years in service and knew exactly how documents that were meant to be believed needed to be constructed. Specific, dated, without emotion that could be dismissed as hysteria, and without omission that could be used to question completeness. Daniel sat across from her both evenings and read each draft and occasionally suggested a sentence or pointed to a phrase that could be sharpened. He had a particular instinct for the direct statement, for cutting to the factual bone of a thing without ornament. They worked in the way of people who have established a working language, small and efficient. No preamble, no performance. On the second evening, when the second letter was finished and drying, Clara looked up and found Daniel looking at her with the same evaluating quality he had given to the repaired trap cords on her second day. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You're looking at something." "I'm looking at the fact that you wrote that letter the way a lawyer would write it." "I've had a lot of practice writing things that had to count," she said. "For who?" She put the pen down. She thought for a moment about how much of this to give. "When I was in service," she said carefully, "I found it useful to keep records, dates, incidents, names, proof of things that had happened." She looked at the letter. "The kind of proof you need when the word of a serving woman and the word of a man with a good name go into the same room and only one of them comes out. Daniel said nothing for a moment. "Did you ever use them?" he said. "Those records." "Once," she said. "It was enough." He nodded. He did not ask more than she had offered. "These letters will count," he said. "Yes," she said. "They will." Sarah Brennan went down the mountain with Elias on the morning of the 9th day. Before she left, she stood with Clara outside the cabin in the cold, clear morning, and they looked at each other the way women look at each other when they have been through something together that didn't ask permission before arriving. "You'll be all right up here?" Sarah said. "Yes," Clara said. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Sarah looked at the cabin, then at Clara. "The first time I saw you," she said, "on the horse in the yard at Hatch's place, I thought that woman is not afraid, and I thought I want to be whatever it is she is." Clara looked at the mountain. "I was afraid," she said. "I just didn't have room for it right then." Sarah smiled. A small, private, real smile. She picked up her bag and followed Elias to the horses. Clara watched them go until the tree line took them. Then she went back inside. The cold that night was different. Not colder in temperature, but heavier somehow. The specific weight of a mountain winter that had been patient for weeks and had decided to remind everyone that patience was a limited resource. The stove worked hard. The wind moved through the ridge above the cabin with a low, sustained sound that Clara had learned meant sustained, not passing. She woke at 3 in the morning with her teeth chattering and an understanding before she was fully conscious that something was wrong with her body. She had felt this before, not often, but enough to know what it meant. The particular combination of bone-deep cold and the specific heaviness behind her eyes and the wrong heat in her face that did not match the wrong cold everywhere else. She sat up. The room tilted very slightly. She put her feet on the floor and waited for it to stop tilting. It did not entirely stop. She managed to get to the stove. She managed to add fuel the right size, the right position, though her hands were not entirely steady. She managed to get back to the bunk and lie down and pull both blankets to her chin. She was still shivering when she heard Daniel's boots in the main room. Not yet dawn. He was up for the early check. He came to the storeroom door, looked in. She could not see his face well in the dark, but she could hear the quality of his stillness change. He crossed the room and put his hand on her forehead, a brief, flat, complete assessment. Then he moved. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had handled emergencies alone in remote country for 12 years and had long since decided that the time between recognizing a problem and beginning to solve it should be as short as possible. He built the stove up to its maximum safe output. He moved the armchair close to it and settled Clara there with both blankets and the spare coat from the peg by the door. He heated water and made a strong infusion from the dried herbs he kept in the third shelf, yarrow and elderflower, and something resinous she didn't recognize, and put the cup in her hands. "Drink it," he said. "All of it, even if it tastes terrible." "Does it taste terrible?" she said. "Yes," he said. She drank it. It tasted terrible. He sat down in the other chair close enough to reach her and waited. The fever moved through her in waves over the following hours. Sometimes she was hot enough that the room seemed too bright even in lamplight. Sometimes she was cold enough that both blankets felt like paper. Sometimes she was somewhere between the two and could follow a thought in a straight line for a minute or two before it curved away from her. Daniel stayed. He replaced the cool cloths on her forehead with the steady attention of a man who had watched other people's conditions carefully enough for long enough to know what staying steady looked like and what deteriorating looked like, and to understand the difference. She slept and woke and slept again. Once she woke to find it full dark outside and the stove burning high and Daniel sitting in the chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded and his eyes on the floor and on his face, an expression she had not seen there before and would not have been able to name precisely even if she had been well. Once she thought she heard him speaking, very quietly, not to her. She could not catch the words. The fever broke in the deep hours of the second night. She knew it from the sweat, the particular release of it, the sudden sense of weight lifting, and she lay still for a while and let the cabin come back into focus around her. The stove was burning low. The lamp was out. In the chair beside her in the darkness, Daniel was asleep, or as close to asleep as he seemed to get his breathing slow and his body completely still. One of his hands rested on the armrest. His other hand had apparently at some point in the hours of keeping watch come to rest on her arm where it lay outside the blanket. He did not know he had done it. She looked at his hand on her arm for a long time. She was very careful not to move. After a while she turned her hand over slowly, quietly, and placed it over his, lightly, the way you place something fragile in a space that might not be ready for it. He did not wake. She lay in the recovering quiet and listened to the mountain breathe, and held on to the warmth of a hand that had stayed through 2 full nights without being asked to. Outside, very faintly, the sky began to lighten. The fire was still burning. In the morning he was awake before she opened her eyes. He was at the stove and the kettle was on, and when she turned her head, she found him looking at her with that flat, complete attention. "Fever broke?" he said. "Yes," she said. He poured water into a cup, plain cool, and brought it to her. "Slow," he said. She drank slowly. He stood nearby and watched her color come back and her eyes sharpen, and something in his face did a thing she would think about later when she had the energy to think carefully. Something that was not the face he showed to the mountain or the trail or the trap line. Something smaller and older and considerably less managed than any of that. She looked up at him. "You stayed," she said. "I did," he said. 2 nights, give or take. She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Daniel." It was the first time she had used his given name. He looked at the window. Outside, the mountain was doing what it did, enormous and indifferent and still. A jay called somewhere in the spruce above the ridge. "The storm's passing," he said. "I need to check the trap line when you're steady." "Go," she said. "I'll be fine." He did not go immediately. He stood for another moment, the particular hesitation of a man who has spent 12 years not hesitating and is now learning slowly and against the grain of everything he has built that sometimes not going is the right answer. Then he took his coat from the peg, checked the stove one more time. "I'll be back before noon," he said. He went out into the morning. Clara lay back and looked at the ceiling of the cabin, the hand-fitted logs, the chinked gaps, the crossbeam with the traps hanging in order of size, and thought about the quality of 2 days of being kept watch over without a single word about obligation or debt or what it cost the keeper. She thought about a man who had spent 12 years learning to need nothing and no one, and she thought about how different needing nothing looked from the inside to how it looked from 2 chairs beside a stove at 3 in the morning. Outside, his boot steps moved through the snow toward the tree line and then were quiet. The mountain said nothing. The fire held. Recovery on a mountain in January looked like this. It looked like Clara sitting in the armchair near the stove for 2 full days while Daniel managed the trap line and the woodpile and the cooking without comment or complaint, setting food at her elbow at regular intervals, the way you set fuel beside a stove, not because you were asked to, but because it was necessary, and you were the one who understood that. It looked like her asking on the 3rd day to go outside, just to stand in the cold air for a few minutes, just to remember that the world was still the size it had been before the fever had reduced it to the dimensions of one warm room. Daniel stood in the doorway and watched her walk to the edge of the clearing and back. He did not offer his arm. He did not hover. He simply stood where she could see him if she needed to turn around and find something solid. She made it to the edge and back without stopping. She came inside and sat down and drank the coffee he had ready. "Tomorrow I'll check the near trap line with you," she said. "You won't," he said. "Day after then." He looked at her. "We'll see." That was not no. She filed it accordingly. On the 4th day after the fever broke, Daniel went to reset the eastern section of the trap line. He was an hour out when he found the first one, a trap his properly set 4 days ago sitting open, not sprung, not triggered, opened from the outside by someone who knew the mechanism. The release was clean, someone who had taken the time to do it properly rather than just kicking it free. He crouched and looked at the ground around it. The snow had covered most traces, but not all. One set of boot prints partially filled. Dress shoes, or at minimum shoes built for surfaces that were not this one. The toe dug in where proper boots would have gripped. He followed the prints to the second trap, also open, also clean. He stood up and looked at the ridge above him. There was a natural vantage point up there, a shelf of granite outcropping partially sheltered by a dead lodgepole pine where a person could see most of the eastern slope below the cabin, where a person could sit with a glass and watch the trails and the clearing and the door without being seen from below. Daniel went up there. The snow on the rock shelf had been disturbed. Someone had stood here for long enough to shift their weight several times. The heel indentations were deep. They had stood here and watched. He looked down at the cabin, the south-facing window, the door, the trail from the trading post. He looked at the tracks leading away from the shelf down the back of the ridge toward the southeast trail which ran well clear of the main road and came out 2 miles below Cedar Fork on the valley road. Someone who did not want to be seen coming or going. He walked the tracks as far as he could before the terrain required a horse he had not brought. Then he turned and came back. He reset both traps. He noted 3 things in his mind with the same precision. He noted weather signs and ice conditions and the particular behavior of animals in a season, one person not local watching the cabin from above. Not there to confront. There to observe and report. He came back to the cabin and did not say anything to Clara about it. But he spent 20 minutes before dark checking the perimeter of the clearing, looking at sight lines, looking at the road. That night he moved his rifle from the pegs by the door to the floor beside his bunk. Clara found the envelope on the 6th day of her recovery. She had gone to her traveling bag for the extra needles she kept wrapped in the inner lining. Her good needles, the ones she had carried for 7 years through every household and every position and every new beginning that turned out to be something other than a beginning. And there between the needle packet and the spare stockings she had folded very carefully before leaving St. Louis, because she had not known how long she would be traveling, was the second envelope. She had put it there herself. She had carried it for 23 days and had not opened it. She had pushed it to the back of her mind with such consistent discipline that on most days it stayed there without much effort. She picked it up now and looked at the return address. Henderson Household Management, St. Louis, Missouri. The formal letterhead of a household that employed lawyers the way other people employed cooks constantly and for everything. She turned the envelope over. The seal was still intact. She thought about the boot prints Daniel had mentioned he had told her 2 evenings ago quietly without alarm, as one states a fact about trail conditions, someone watching from the ridge above the eastern slope. He had not said what he thought it meant because he had not been certain, but his certainty had not been required for her to understand. She knew what it meant. She sat down at the table and opened the envelope. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. The language was careful and formal in the way of documents designed to sound reasonable while threatening an outcome. The substance was simple. Clara Holt. Her name, her real name used 3 times in 3 paragraphs, was requested to sign and return the enclosed affidavit which stated that her departure from Henderson Household Service had been voluntary and without incident. Failure to comply would result in legal action pertaining to certain items missing from the household inventory at the time of her departure. Items she had not taken. Items she had been very careful never to be alone in a room with specifically because she had understood that a day like this one was always possible. She set the letter on the table. She looked at the window. The mountain sat in its enormous white silence outside, entirely unmoved by the paperwork of St. Louis households. She sat there for a moment and let herself be afraid. Not the wide ambient fear of the journey up the mountain, not the diffuse dread of the storm or the fever. This was the specific familiar fear of a particular name, Henderson, and a particular mechanism she had spent 4 years watching operate and 2 years trying to stay ahead of. Then she folded it up. She put it in the pocket of her dress, and she went back to the mending. Daniel came in an hour later. He set down the morning's catch, 2 marten, a good beaver, and began the skinning work at the outside post. When he came in, Clara was still at the table. He looked at her once, that brief, complete assessment. He poured 2 cups of coffee. He set one at her place. He sat down. He did not ask. She pulled the letter from her pocket and put it on the table between them. He read it without touching it. When he had read it, he looked up at her. "Clara Holt," he said. "That is my actual name," she said. "I used Ashford when I left because I knew they might try to follow. The agency correspondence was in the name Ashford. I thought that would be enough distance." She looked at the letter. The person on your ridge, they tracked it back. Someone connected both names. When did this come? 3 weeks before I arrived here, the morning before I left St. Louis. She paused. I didn't open it then. I didn't want to know what it said until I had somewhere to be. He sat with this for a moment. The items they are referring to, he said. Did you take them? No. Will they be able to prove that you did? Probably not, she said. But that may not be the point. The point may simply be to create a situation where I have to return and answer for it, where I have to be in the same room as people who have lawyers, and I don't. You need a lawyer. Yes. Elias knows a man in Salt Lake City, uses him for property matters. He stood up. Next time I go down, I'll get the name. She looked at him. You don't have to. You were brought here by a forged letter using my name, he said. Whatever followed from that is partly my business. He picked up his coffee. I don't mean that as charity. I mean it as a simple fact. She held his eyes for a moment. His expression was the same as it always was, flat, direct, not offering more than it contained. All right, she said. He nodded and went back to his work. Clara looked at the letter on the table. Then she turned it over so the Henderson letterhead faced the wood and picked up her needle and thread. That evening, before the lamp was lit, Clara went to the storeroom to bring out the extra candle stock she had reorganized 3 days earlier. She was reaching for the upper shelf when her hand touched something unexpected. Not the candles, a flat piece of cured elk hide, soft and well-worked, folded and tucked between the candle boxes and the wall. She drew it out. On the hide in pencil was a drawing, a floor plan, detailed, precise, the work of someone who thought in 3 dimensions and drew accurately from those thoughts. A cabin layout, this cabin recognizably, but with something added, a new section drawn in along the east wall, a room, larger than the storeroom with a south-facing window indicated by dotted lines, and inside the drawn room a shelf along the low wall. A window seat indicated by a simple bracket. A hook beside the interior door marked with a small circle and the notation 60 inches. 60 inches from the floor. The height a woman of average build could reach without stretching. She looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she turned the hide over. On the back, in the same pencil in handwriting she did not recognize, practiced careful, a date, and 2 words beneath it, spring. Finally. The date was 1871. Clara stood in the dim storeroom with the old drawing in her hands. She understood now what she was looking at. She understood the hook by the door, the pale blue cup, the south-facing window in the main room that let in the best of the morning light. She understood that she was standing in a house that had been built for a woman who had never arrived, that every considered detail of this cabin's construction, every measured height and sheltered corner and carefully placed hook, was the physical record of a man who had loved someone completely enough to think about where she would hang her coat, who had then spent 12 years living in the evidence of that love. She put the drawing back exactly where she had found it. She took the candles and went out and closed the storeroom door. She did not say anything that evening, or the next. But on the morning 2 days later she came around the south side of the cabin to bring in a stack of curing pelts that Daniel had asked her to move before the afternoon weather came in, and found him there. He was measuring. He had a length of knotted cord stretched along the east wall of the cabin, checking the run of the logs, and in his other hand was the cured elk hide she had found in the storeroom. The drawing. He was comparing the east wall's existing run to the notations on the hide. He had not heard her come around the corner. She stood still. He moved the cord along the wall, made a mark in the snow at the corner join, consulted the drawing, made another mark further along. He was planning the addition. From the 1871 drawing, he was still building it. Clara stood in the cold and looked at the marks in the snow, and at the drawing in his hand, and at the cabin wall that he was measuring with the calm precision of a man who has known exactly what he wanted to build for 13 years and has simply been waiting for the conditions to allow it. She did not know what she felt standing there. It was complex in the way that things are complex when they contain both understanding and something sharper than understanding, When you can see why a person has done something and simultaneously understand that the thing, regardless of why, is going to require a conversation that neither of you is quite ready for. She picked up the pelts. She went back inside. She waited 2 days. Not because she needed time to decide what to say. She knew what needed to be said from the moment she came around the cabin corner and saw the marks in the snow. She waited because she had learned in the weeks since arriving on this mountain that timing mattered enormously with Daniel Grant. Say the right thing at the wrong moment, and the wall went up, and you were back to the beginning. Say it when the space was right, when the stove was settled and the work was done, and the particular quality of the evening had that low, quiet weight that allowed difficult things to be heard, and something different was possible. She chose a Thursday evening in late January, 2 weeks after the fever broke. The weather had been clear for 3 days. The mountain was in one of its brief, cold, crystalline phases, where the sky at night was so dense with stars it seemed to press down toward the tree line. Daniel had come in from an extended trapline run. Good catches, the beaver line was active and had eaten, and was at the work table with a new section of harness. Clara was across the room with the ledger she had been keeping of weather observations and fuel usage. She went to the storeroom. She came back with the cured elk hide. She laid it on the table between them. He looked at it. He did not say anything for a moment. "I found it when I was getting candles," she said. "I put it back. I wasn't going to say anything about it." She paused. "And then I came around the south side of the cabin 2 days ago and saw you measuring the east wall." He was still looking at the drawing. "You're building the room," she said, "from the 1871 plan. The east wall is sound," he said. "Spring is a good time to—" "Daniel." He stopped. She was not angry. Her voice was steady and direct, the voice she used for things that needed to be said clearly and without softening. "How long have you been planning the addition?" "A long time." "Since before I came?" "Yes." "Since 1871. A pause. "Yes." Clara looked at the drawing on the table, at the window seat, the measured hook, the shelf at the right height. "You've been building this cabin for a woman who has been gone for 13 years, she said, "and you are still building it." He did not deny it. "I'm not saying that to accuse you of anything," she said. "I'm saying it because I need you to hear it said out loud, because I don't think you've heard it that way. I don't think anyone has said it to you as a plain fact." "It's my cabin," he said. "Yes, it is," she said. "And it's a beautiful one, and every measured inch of it tells me the kind of man you are, the kind who thinks about how high a hook needs to be for someone else to reach it, who faces windows south because morning light matters to people who are not you." She looked at him. "But Daniel, I have been living in this cabin for 3 weeks, and I need to ask you something directly. When you look at this drawing, when you measure that wall, who are you building it for?" The fire ticked. The mountain was enormous and quiet outside. He said nothing for a long time. Clara waited. She was good at waiting for things that mattered. "I don't know," he said finally. It came out rough at the edges, the way truth comes out when it hasn't been spoken in a long time. "I built this place for her, every part of it. And when she died, I kept going because I didn't know how to stop. And after a while—" He stopped. He looked at the drawing. "After a while, the building was the only way I still knew how to—" He stopped again. "To love her," Clara said. "Yes. And now—" He looked at the table. "Now you are here," he said, "and you reached the hook without stretching. And I noticed that. And I did not know what to do with having noticed it." Clara was very still. "So you went back to the drawing," she said. "Yes. You went back to the 1871 drawing because it was something you already knew how to do." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the drawing as if it were the kind of map that could tell him where he was if he read it correctly enough. She leaned forward and put her hand flat on the hide beside the drawing, not covering it, just present. "Daniel," she said, "I am not her. I know that. And I'm not asking you to stop loving her. I'm not asking you to stop building things that honor what you had. But there is a difference between honoring someone and building a room for a ghost, while a real person is living in the same house. She paused. And I think you know that difference. I think that is exactly why you didn't tell me about the measuring. He was very still. Because if you had told me, she said quietly, you would have had to hear it out loud, and you weren't ready to hear it. The silence that followed was the longest in Clara's experience of this cabin's many silences. Longer than the first night of the storm, longer than the 2 nights of the fever. The kind of silence that has a specific weight and texture because both people in it are waiting for the same thing to happen and neither one is going to force it. Daniel stood up. He walked to the storeroom. She heard the sound of the rearranged shelf, the specific place where she had found the drawing, and then the lower sound of the wooden trunk she had not yet opened its lid lifting. She looked at the fire. He came back. He was carrying the photograph. She had not seen it before. She had known it existed. Everything in the cabin suggested it must. The same way the absence of curtains and rugs and pictures suggested their deliberate removal. But she had not seen it. He set it on the table. Margaret Lowe, in a nurse's uniform in a studio portrait made in the early style of the previous decade. A face that was clear and capable and held even in the stillness of a photograph the quality of genuine attention, the look of someone present in the room with you rather than performing presence. Clara looked at her for a long moment. She was 30 seconds into any conversation, and she'd have the whole room, Daniel said. He sat back down, but differently than before. The specific arrangement of a man who has put something down after carrying it a long time. She was the least patient person I ever met. She had no tolerance for stupidity or waste. She once dressed down a general for ordering men into weather that would cost them more than the objective was worth. A pause. He backed down. Of course he did, Clara said. She would have hated this cabin, he said. She would have had curtains up in the first week, and she would have wanted a garden, and she would have told me the armchair was in the wrong position, and she would have been right about all of it. Clara smiled, small, genuine, not performed. She sounds formidable, she said. She was everything, he said. Simple, complete. Clara looked at the photograph for another moment. Then she looked at Daniel. I know, she said. He picked up the photograph. He looked at it one more time directly without flinching, the way you look at something you are deciding to carry differently rather than put down. Then he stood and carried it back to the storeroom. This time she heard the trunk close. He came back and sat down. He picked up the elk-hide drawing. He looked at the room on the east wall, the south window, the measured hook, the shelf, and then he looked at Clara across the table. The window facing south is still a good idea, he said. It is, she agreed. But I'd want to know what you'd do with the shelf. She looked at him carefully. What do you mean? I mean if I'm going to build a room, he said slowly, as if working out the words as they came. I should know who I'm building it for, what they need, what height things should be, what the window looks at. Clara held his gaze. That sounds like a different question than the one you started with tonight. It is, he said. The fire held its steady warmth. Outside the mountain winter pressed against the walls and found them sound. The shelf, Clara said after a moment, should be low enough to be useful and deep enough to hold actual things, not decorative, functional. She paused. And the window should face south and slightly west. Morning light is fine, but what you want in a room like that is the afternoon. Daniel looked at the drawing. He took the pencil from his shirt pocket and made a small adjustment to the window notation. Why the afternoon? He said. Because morning light makes you get up and start working, she said. Afternoon light makes you sit down and stay. He looked at the adjusted notation. All right, he said. The letter from Salt Lake City came 12 days later. Elias brought it up on a Tuesday. He had taken to coming up once a week, now not just for supply delivery, but in the gradually normalizing way of a man who is working his way back toward a friendship he had almost destroyed, and is doing it the only way available, which is to show up consistently and be useful and say less than he wants to. Daniel accepted the letter from the lawyer without comment. He read it that evening after supper. He handed it across the table to Clara. The lawyer's name was Ambrose Whitfield, no relation to anyone in Cedar Fork, and useful for matters of property and testimony, and the kind of documentation that territorial authorities required before moving on complaints against registered businesses. Elias had explained the situation. The lawyer had written to say he could help with both matters, the Henderson affidavit and the agency testimony. "He'll need everything in writing," Daniel said. "What you already wrote, plus a formal statement about the Henderson letter." "I can do that," Clara said. "And there's a secondary matter." He tapped the bottom of the page. "He says the authorities in St. Louis have begun an inquiry into the agency, based on the letters we sent." Clara looked at that line. She read it twice. "Already," she said. "Your letters were specific," Daniel said. "Dated and specific. He says that is what moved it forward faster than usual." She set the letter down. She looked at the stove for a moment. "There will be more women," she said, "who went through this, who are still dealing with it." "Yes," Daniel said. "If the inquiry opens formally, they'll need to be found." "That's what inquiries do," Daniel said. "They find people." "I want to write again," Clara said. "Not just for the legal process. To the newspapers, the St. Louis papers, and the Salt Lake paper. Elias said there's a woman's advocacy organization in Denver. He mentioned it when he was here last week." Daniel looked at her. "That is a larger project than a letter," he said. "I know what it is," she said. "Will you help me?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that she now understood was not hesitation, but consideration, the genuine computation of someone who did not say yes lightly and did not say no lightly, and took the space between them seriously. "Yes," he said. They wrote for 3 evenings. It was the most consecutive conversation they had yet had, not in the sense of talking continuously, but in the sense of working toward the same thing with full attention, each contributing from their different angle. Clara knew what needed to be felt and understood and believed. Daniel knew what needed to be stated and documented and impossible to dismiss. They developed a working method without discussing it. Clara drafted, Daniel read. Clara revised based on his specific suggestions. He would circle a phrase and say simply "too much," or "needs the date," or once looking at a passage about the women who had nowhere to go, "This is true. Leave it exactly as it is." On the second evening they were working on the letter to the Denver organization when Clara stopped mid-sentence and looked up. "There's something else," she said. He waited. She pulled the Henderson letter from her folder. She had been keeping everything organized in the calfskin folder she carried in her traveling bag, the accumulated paper record of her adult life, and turned it to show him the signature at the bottom. Not the Henderson name. The lawyer's name. The man who had drafted it. Alderman J. Whitfield. St. Louis, Missouri. Daniel read the name. "Different Whitfield," he said. "Common enough name." "Yes," she said. "But Elias mentioned a Whitfield here in Cedar Fork when I was in the trading post. He said it carefully, the way you say someone's name carefully when there's more you're not saying." Daniel looked at the lawyer's signature. He looked at the window. He set the letter down. "James Whitfield," he said. "His family holds land in the valley below this mountain. Bought it about 13 years ago." His voice was completely level. "From my family. After Margaret died." Clara waited. "I wasn't in a position to argue price at the time," he said. "I had decided to come up here. The land was going to sit unused. He made an offer, and I took it." "Was it a fair price?" A long pause. "No," he said, "but I didn't care what it was." He looked at the window. "I didn't care about much at that point. And since then Whitfield has done well for himself in Cedar Fork. His son went to St. Louis for law school. Came back with connections." He picked up the letter again, looked at the signature. "Alderman J. Whitfield." "The son," Clara said. "The son." Daniel agreed. She looked at him. "The people in town who have the wrong idea about you, Elias mentioned it, that someone had spread a story, that you went up the mountain because you were shamed," Daniel said. "Yes. There was a version of events that went around Cedar Fork after I left, that Margaret had rejected me, that I'd come up here because I couldn't face people after." He said it without particular emotion, the flat matter-of-fact recitation of a story that had long since stopped surprising him. "I knew people believed it. I never bothered to correct it." "Why not?" "Because I was up here," he said, "and they were down there, and it didn't seem to matter." "It matters if someone started it deliberately," Clara said. "If someone had a reason to want you gone and discredited." He looked at the lawyer's signature for a long moment. "Someone who bought land from a man in grief," Clara said carefully, "might have an interest in that man staying in grief, in staying up on the mountain, in never coming back down and asking questions about what his land was worth and whether the price was what it should have been." The stove ticked. "That is a serious thing to say," Daniel said. "I know it is," Clara said. "I'm not saying it lightly." She put her pen down. "But I have spent my adult life in houses where people with money and standing did small, careful, deliberate things to keep other people in positions that suited them. I know what that looks like. I know how it moves." He was quiet for a very long time. Outside the mountain was doing its deep night thing. The silence that was not absence but the presence of something enormous and old and entirely uninterested in the arguments of the people sheltering at its base. "I'll go down to Cedar Fork tomorrow," Daniel said finally. "I'll come with you," Clara said. "This one I'll go alone." She looked at him. He was not shutting her out. She could read the difference by now. He was protecting something that needed to be handled in a particular way by a particular person without witnesses. "All right," she said. He picked up the letter one more time. Then he set it down and went back to the draft they had been working on. He did not say anything more about Whitfield that evening, but Clara noticed that his handwriting on the last paragraph was slightly harder than usual, slightly more definite, as if the pen were being used by a hand that had made up its mind about something. Daniel came back from Cedar Fork in the late afternoon of the following day. Clara was at the window when she heard his horse on the trail. She watched him come in through the tree line and cross the clearing and dismount at the post. He unsaddled with his usual efficiency, took care of the horse, came inside. He hung his coat. He poured coffee. He sat down. She gave him his time. "I spoke with Elias first," he said, "about the story, about where it started. And Elias had heard the same thing I had, that Margaret rejected me, that I was too ashamed to stay." He looked at his coffee. He believed the correct version because he knew the truth, but he said most of the town had heard the other one for so long it had the weight of fact. Did he know who started it? He had a suspicion. He'd always had a suspicion. Daniel looked at the window. "He never pushed on it because he thought it would only make things worse for me, that bringing it up would just mean more people discussing my business." "He was protecting you again," Clara said. "In his way." "In his way," Daniel agreed. He did not say it warmly, but not coldly either. Something in between that was more honest than either. "And Whitfield," Clara said. "I went to see him." "What did you say?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, "I told him that I knew how he had bought that land, that you knew, that Elias knew, that the lawyer in Salt Lake City was now aware of the connection between the Henderson firm and the Whitfield name." He paused. "I told him he had some time to decide what he wanted to do about that." "What did he say?" "Nothing, which is the only correct answer in that situation." Clara looked at him. "Was that enough?" "For now," Daniel said. "Whitfield is a careful man. He will calculate very precisely what is in his interest, and he will act accordingly." He picked up his coffee. "I didn't go there to destroy him. I went there to make sure he understood that the position he thought he held comfortable unexamined was no longer unexamined. And the story about you in town, that will take longer." He said it without bitterness. "Stories do." Clara nodded. "But there's something else," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a folded paper. He put it on the table. "The inquiry in St. Louis has moved faster than the lawyer expected. They have identified the principal operator of the agency." Clara looked at the paper. "Voss. Arthur Voss," Daniel said. "The inquiry has a name and an address and testimony from the Salt Lake City contact. What they need now is a direct statement from someone who can place him as the author of the scheme, not just a recipient." "I can't place him directly," Clara said. "I never met him." "No," Daniel said. "But there are records, the agency letterhead, the fee receipts, the specific language of the correspondence." He looked at the paper. The lawyer says what they have may be enough, but he wants to know if we can find anyone who dealt with Voss directly, anyone who knew him. Clara looked at Daniel. He was looking at the paper. "You knew him," she said. "I served with him for 2 years," Daniel said. "I know his methods. I know his handwriting. I know the specific way he constructed a story that sounded like one thing and was another." He paused. "The letters sent to the women. I read the copies you kept. The way they were written, the specific phrases, the way the sentences were structured." He stopped. "What?" Clara said. "I recognize them," he said. "Not the words, the construction, the way he used to write field reports, very official sounding, very precise, nothing that could be questioned on the surface, but always with something underneath that was arranged for his benefit." He looked at Clara. "He wrote those letters the same way. Official, reassuring, every detail in place. Nothing you could point to and say, here, this is where the lie is, until you were already somewhere you hadn't intended to be." Clara sat with this for a moment. "You could write a statement," she said, "not as a victim of the scheme, as someone who can identify the method and the hand." "Yes," he said, "that would be considerable. I know. It would also mean," she chose her words, "it would mean your name in a public document, connected to this matter. People in Cedar Fork would hear about it." "Yes," he said, "and you don't care about that," she said. It was not a question. "I don't care about most of what people in Cedar Fork think," he said. "I've proven that adequately." Something moved briefly at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "But there may be 1 or 2 things worth changing." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. "Tell me what you know about Voss," she said. "I'll write it, and you tell me where I've gotten it wrong." He picked up his coffee. He looked at the window where the last of the afternoon light was going long and gold across the snow the way it did in the hour before dark, when the mountain stopped being purely difficult and became briefly something close to beautiful. Then he began to talk. He talked for a long time, longer than she had heard him talk about anything. Not about the war in the dramatic sense, not about battles or officers or the famous movements of famous campaigns. He talked about Voss the way you talk about someone you spent 2 years watching at close range. The specific shape of his intelligence, the way he managed people, finding the right lever for each one, the right appeal, the right combination of authority and collegiality that made you trust him before you had decided to. The way he wrote orders and dispatches and requests in language that was always technically correct and always structured to protect himself if something went wrong. "He was never the one holding the bag," Daniel said. "He arranged things so that there was always someone between him and the consequence, someone who had signed a paper or witnessed a transaction or been given an instruction that could be pointed to later." "A careful man," Clara said. "A specific kind of careful," Daniel said. "The kind that comes from watching other people get caught and deciding you are smarter than they are." "And you trusted him for 2 years, yes." He paused. "He was good at being trusted. That was his skill. The letters I read, the ones sent to you and to Sarah and the others, I could hear him in them, the same careful construction, the same specific reassurances." He looked at the table. "It takes a particular kind of person to look at desperate women and see an inventory," Clara wrote steadily. She was not transcribing, she was translating, taking what he said and shaping it into the specific form that a formal statement required, precise, verifiable, signed. When they were done, the fire had burned low and the lamp was the only light in the cabin. She read the statement back to him. He listened. He asked for 2 small corrections, dates, 1 specific wording. Then he said, "That's it." She wrote the final version clean and put it in the folder with the rest. "It will be enough," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think it will." They sat in the quiet of the after-work evening, the particular silence of people who have done something difficult and completed it and have not yet moved on to whatever comes next. "Daniel," Clara said. He looked at her. "I need to tell you something." She folded her hands on the table. "When I came up this mountain, I had 3 things with me: my bag, the agency letter, and the Henderson letter." She paused. And I was Clara Ashford, who was going to start over in a new place with a new name and leave Clara Holt behind in St. Louis with everything that had happened there. He said nothing. Waiting. I haven't been Clara Holt to anyone in over 2 years, she said. Not because I'm ashamed of the name, but because when you run from something far enough at some point, you stop being the person who ran and start being the person who arrived, and that felt like a useful change. She looked at the folder. But I've been using the Holt name in the statements, in everything I've signed for the lawyer, because it's the name that can be verified, the name that connects to the agency records and the Henderson records and everything that needs to connect. Yes, he said. And because, she stopped, because I think the name stopped being something to hide from when I started using it to fight back. He looked at her for a long moment. Clara Holt, he said, testing it. Not differently than he had once tested the word friend or the word Wednesday, just making sure the word fit the person it was meant to describe. Yes, she said, that is your name. It is. He nodded once. Then that is what I'll call you, he said, when it matters, when it needs to be right. She looked at the lamp. The wick was burning evenly. She had trimmed it that morning the way she did every morning now, automatically the way you maintain things that are worth maintaining. Holt, she said quietly, testing it herself. Holt, he agreed. Outside the mountain, winter moved through its long dark hours. The cold pressed against the walls and found them sound. The fire needed no attention. She had banked it correctly before supper, and it would hold until morning. Clara looked at the east wall of the cabin. At the point where the new room would begin when spring came and the ground was workable, and two people who had not planned to build anything together found themselves standing outside with a measuring cord and a drawing that was finally, after 13 years, going to become what it was always meant to be. Not the room from the 1871 drawing. Something else. Something for someone who was here. She didn't say this. She didn't need to. She turned back to her folder and made the last notation in the ledger for the day: temperature at evening, fuel status, weather for tomorrow, and closed it neatly. Daniel was quiet across the room with his harness work the way he was most evenings, and the cabin was warm and the mountain was enormous outside, and neither of them was anywhere near done with what was beginning. February on the winter range does not announce itself as February anywhere else does. There is no softening, no preliminary warmth. February up there is simply the third month of a siege, and it conducts itself accordingly, hard certain without apology. The snow depth on the cabin roof reached its maximum in the second week, 3 feet of dense pack that Daniel knocked down with a long pole every 4 days, because the weight was not something you left to accumulate. The temperature at dawn stayed below 0 on most mornings. The horses spent more time in the barn. But in the third week of February, Clara noticed something. The light. Not warmer, not yet, but longer. The difference between the light at 4 in the afternoon and the light at 4:30 was becoming for the first time since she had arrived a difference that mattered. The mountain was still winter, but the sky above it was beginning to remember that it had other responsibilities. She noted it in the fuel ledger: light 447, clear temp -4, and then looked at what she had written and felt something she had not felt since getting off the train in Salt Lake City 3 months ago. She felt like the next thing might be different from the last thing. The letter from the territorial office came up with Elias on a Thursday, not addressed to Clara. Addressed to Daniel Grant, citizen with a formal seal and the weight of institutional language inside, which was, when you stripped it down to its substance, the news that the Western Hearts Matrimonial Agency of St. Louis, Missouri, had been placed under suspension of operations pending a full inquiry, that its principal operator, Arthur Voss, had been detained for questioning, and that the signed testimonies received from Grant C. Holt and S. Brennan had been entered into the formal record as primary evidence. Daniel read it at the table. He handed it to Clara without comment. She read it. She read it again. Then she set it down and looked at the window. Elias was sitting across from them, having delivered the letter along with a sack of flour and the week's newspapers from Salt Lake City, drinking his coffee with the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for a particular morning and is now trying to decide how to sit inside it properly. "It's done," he said. "The inquiry isn't finished," Clara said. "No, but it started properly. It won't stop now." He looked at her. The Denver organization wrote back. The woman who runs it, Margaret Daly, she says your letter was the clearest account she has received of how these schemes operate. She wants to use it as a model for what women in similar situations should document. Clara looked at the letter. My letter, she said. Your letter, Elias confirmed. With your name on it. Clara Holt. She was quiet for a moment. She picked up her coffee. She looked at Daniel. He was already looking at her. That flat, complete attention. Not saying anything, not needing to, just present in the room with her the way the mountain was present, solid and without ceremony, simply there. Good, she said. Sarah Brennan came up the mountain one last time in early March, not alone. John Murphy rode beside her, a man of 35 with a weathered face and a straightforward manner, and 3 children who had been calling Sarah by her first name since her second day at the ranch, which said most of what needed to be said about the situation. They sat at the cabin table and drank coffee and talked about practical things for a while. The ranch, the children, the spring planting. Murphy mentioned that his eldest had taken it upon herself to teach Sarah how to read a cattle brand, which Sarah had found more interesting than she expected. After a while, Murphy took his coffee outside to look at the south slope with Daniel the way men do when they want to give women the room to talk. Sarah looked at Clara across the table. You're staying, she said. I haven't decided that formally, Clara said. Yes, you have, Sarah said. You decided it before the fever. You just haven't said it out loud yet. Clara looked at her hands. It's more complicated than staying, she said. Most things worth doing are. Clara stopped. She considered. He carries a great deal. So do you, Sarah said. That's not an obstacle, that's a reason. Clara looked at the south window. The afternoon light was coming in at the angle she had described to Daniel, lower and warmer than morning, the kind that made you want to sit down and stay. He had adjusted the drawing to account for it. She had watched him do it, the small, deliberate pencil mark, and had not said anything and had not needed to. He's starting to build again, Clara said. The east room. He marked the foundation line last week. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Did he ask you what you wanted in it? He asked me about the shelf, Clara said. And the window. And I told him. Sarah smiled, the private, knowing smile of a woman who has watched 2 people take a very long time to arrive at something obvious and has decided to let them arrive at their own pace. Then you've decided, she said. Clara looked at the window. Yes, she said. I suppose I have. The seeds arrived with Elias on his next visit. Not sent by anyone, not ordered. Just there in a paper sack inside his supply pack, the way Elias did things he wanted to do without making them into events. A seed packet of kitchen garden vegetables, carrots, beans, the dark leafy things that grew well in mountain soil if you put them in the right sun. A packet of something Clara didn't recognize until she read the label, which said simply, Mountain Columbine, perennial, blue. She held the columbine packet and looked at it for a long moment. She went outside. Daniel was at the south side of the cabin measuring the east wall again, the real measurement now, not the exploratory one. He had a wooden stake in the ground at one corner and was running a cord to establish the line of the new foundation. His movements had the settled quality of a man doing work he has thought about so long that when the doing finally arrives it feels less like starting and more like continuing something that was always in progress. She stood beside him. Elias brought seeds, she said. He looked at the packets in her hand. He looked at the cleared strip of south-facing ground between the cabin wall and the tree line, sheltered from the north wind, good drainage, the best light on the property. That strip will take a garden, he said. I know, she said. I've been looking at it for 2 months. He drove the stake the last inch into the semi-frozen ground. He stood up and looked at the cord line, and then at the seed packets, and then at Clara. The ground will be workable in 6 weeks, he said. I know when ground is workable, she said. I've been reading your weather records. A small pause. What do you want planted first? He said. She looked at the strip of ground. She looked at the columbine packet. She thought about perennial, the word for things that come back that don't need replanting, that establish themselves in a place and decide to stay. The columbine last, she said. They need to go in at the right time, or they won't take. She paused. The carrots first. They'll be ready before anything else, and we'll need them. He nodded. He turned back to his cord line. She stood beside him for a moment, looking at the east wall that was about to become something different, at the ground that was about to become a garden, at the mountain above them, enormous and permanent and entirely accustomed to people deciding to build things at its feet. She went back inside to put the seeds in the right place on the shelf, the one at the height she had specified, deep enough to hold actual things, which they did. March came in with 2 days of serious weather and left them on the third day with something that was not quite spring, but was clearly pointing toward it. The snow line moved up the ridge by 2 feet. The creek below the cabin, which had been silent under ice since November, began to speak again, quietly at first, just a murmur under the surface, and then, with more conviction, as the upper ice broke into pieces and the water underneath remembered what it was. Daniel was out on the trap line when Clara came back from the creek with the morning water. She had been doing this for 3 weeks, taking over the morning water run as a matter of course, not because he had asked, not because she had announced it, just because she was up at the same time he was, and the creek was along the way to the woodpile, and there was no reason not to. He had not commented on it. He had simply started leaving the water pails at the door instead of the corner, which was closer to the path she took. They had been leaving things for each other like this for months, establishing small adjustments in their shared geography without discussion, the way 2 people in a working space learn each other's movements and arrange themselves accordingly. Not because they had talked about it, because it was more efficient, and because efficiency was the language they both spoke, and because underneath efficiency in this particular case was something else neither of them had named. She was stacking the second pail inside the door when she found the note. Not a letter, not even a full sentence. Just a folded piece of paper on the table, and inside, seen tracks near east tree line back by noon. Lock the door. She looked at the note. She looked at the door, which she then locked. She looked at the note again. 3 words: lock the door, and what they contained was not instruction, not command, not the practical advice of a man who lived in country where precaution was simply sense. What they contained was the specific quality of someone who before leaving had thought about whether she would be all right, who had thought about it in a way that required the leaving of a note. She put the note on the shelf with the seeds. She did not examine why she put it there. He was back before noon. The tracks had been an elk, a large one, moving through the east timber toward the high meadow. He had followed them to confirm it, because you confirm things up here, because the mountain occasionally used the ordinary to conceal the less ordinary, and a man who stopped checking was a man who eventually stopped being surprised at the wrong moment. He came in and set his rifle on the pegs and turned to find Clara at the table with the weather ledger and a cup of coffee and the particular quality of settled occupation that she had. By now the look of someone who has been exactly where they are for the right amount of time and has no pressing reason to be anywhere else. He hung up his coat. He poured coffee. He sat down across from her. She slid the ledger toward him without looking up his section where she had made the morning temperature notations and left the rest blank for his additions from the trapline check. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the morning entries, date, temperature, cloud direction, the observation about the creek starting to move. "The creek's talking again," he said. "Since this morning," she said, quietly still, but there. He nodded. He picked up the pencil and added his trapline notes in the column beside hers. The 2 sets of handwriting on the same page. His spare vertical exact, hers flowing slightly leaning right, the cursive of a woman who had learned to write in proper schools before those schools stopped being available. He looked at the page for a moment before he closed the ledger. "Clara," he said. She looked up. He had something to say, and he was taking his time with it the way he took his time with everything, completely without pretending the time wasn't being taken. She had learned not to fill this silence, and she did not fill it now. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what comes next." "All right," she said. "The room will be framed by April if the weather holds, finished before June." He looked at the table. "I've been building things for a long time. I know how to do it. What I'm not certain about—" He stopped. "What you're not certain about," she said quietly, completing the space he had left, "is whether I'm building it for the right reason this time," he said. Whether I'm building it because I've understood something or because I've found another way to avoid understanding it. Clara set her pen down. What would the difference look like, she said. He thought about this. Building it for the right reason would mean building it for someone who is here, who I can ask, who can tell me when I've gotten the height of a shelf wrong. He paused. Building it for the wrong reason would mean building it as a way of saying something I haven't found the words for and letting the room say it instead. Both things can be true, she said. Yes, he said. That's what I'm not certain about. She looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked at him. Then ask me, she said. Don't let the room say it. You say it. A long quiet. The creek outside, new-voiced again after 3 months, talked to itself in the low, murmuring way of water that has just remembered it has places to go. I want you to stay, Daniel said. Not as an arrangement, not as the practical resolution of a problem that arrived on my doorstep in a storm. He looked at her directly in the way he looked at things he was examining honestly and without the cushioning of implication. I want you to stay because this place is better with you in it, and I am better. With you in it. He said the last sentence carefully, with the specific care of a man who knows the weight of words when they are meant exactly as stated. I know what that cost you to say, Clara said. I know you do, he said. Then I'll tell you something that costs me something to say, she said. I have been in many houses. Some were better than others. A few were kind. None of them were mine. She looked at the window at the afternoon light coming in at the angle she had described, low and steady, and the color of something that stays. This one feels like mine. Not because you gave it to me, because I've been living in it as if I belonged here and nothing has corrected me. He said nothing. He was looking at her with the same quality of attention he gave to things he was reading for the truth. I want to stay, she said. I am staying. I think I decided that before the fever, the way Sarah said. I just needed to wait until it was something I was choosing, not something I was defaulting to. And now I'm choosing it, she said, deliberately, with my eyes open. The stove ticked its slow count. The creek talked outside. A bird Clara had not heard since autumn called once from somewhere in the high spruce and was answered from further up the ridge. Daniel looked at the table. He looked at the fuel ledger with their two handwritings side by side. He looked at the window, and then at the east wall behind which the new room was waiting to exist. There are practical considerations, he said. There are always practical considerations, Clara said. Elias would say something about propriety if we asked him. Elias said something about propriety, she said, when he forged your name and sent a woman up a mountain in January. I don't think his opinion on the subject carries full weight. Something happened at the corner of Daniel's mouth. Not quite a smile, more precise than that. The specific movement of a man who has been suppressing a particular expression for a long time and is no longer entirely certain that suppression is warranted. No, he said. I don't suppose it does. But, Clara said. But, he agreed. She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them was the table and the ledger and the morning's note still on the shelf with the seeds, and beyond that the east wall, and beyond that the mountain, and beyond that everything that had happened to both of them to arrive at this particular table on this particular morning. Cedar Fork has a church, she said. It does, he said, and a preacher. It does, and you know every trail down to it. Everyone, he said, in any weather. She folded her hands on the table. Then there are no real obstacles, she said, only the question of whether we are ready. He was quiet for a moment. I have been ready for longer than I let myself know, he said. It was the most unguarded thing he had ever said to her. It came out simple and complete the way the truest things do. Clara looked at her folded hands. So have I, she said, though I arrived here with the strong impression that I was looking for entirely different things. What were you looking for? Safety, she said. A roof that was mine. Work that wasn't conditional on someone else's goodwill. She paused. I found all of that. And, she looked up at him. And it turns out, she said, that when you find what you were looking for, it only shows you what you hadn't thought to look for yet. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up. He went to the shelf and took down the seed packets, all of them, the carrots and the beans and the perennial columbine in its small envelope. He set them on the table between them. 6 weeks, he said. That's what you said. That's when the ground will be ready. About 6 weeks, she said. That's enough time, he said, to arrange things properly, if you want them arranged properly. She looked at the seeds on the table. I want them arranged properly, she said. He picked up the perennial packet. He turned it over in his hands the way he had turned over the trap cords on that second day reading it, understanding its construction, deciding what it needed. Columbine last, he said. After the carrots. After the carrots, she agreed. He set the packet back with the others and sat down and picked up the trapline log and resumed his notes for the morning. Clara picked up her pen and went back to the ledger. The stove burned steady. The creek moved through its early spring voice outside. They worked in the quiet of two people who have said the necessary things and do not need to say them again. The wedding was on the 14th of April. Clara wore the dress she had mended twice on the journey out, the dark blue wool, which was the best she had, and which was better than it had any right to be, after everything it had been through. Daniel wore the coat he kept for the rare occasions when Cedar Fork required something other than elk hide. Elias stood beside Daniel at the front of the small church and managed for the duration of the ceremony to maintain an expression that was something between dignity and what a man looks like when he has spent years hoping for a thing and is now watching it happen and cannot entirely believe the arithmetic of it. Martha Croft sat in the third pew and wept without the slightest self-consciousness, which was, Clara thought, one of the kindest things she had ever witnessed. Sarah Brennan sat beside John Murphy and his 3 children. The youngest had fallen asleep against Sarah's arm by the time the vows started and had been left there, and Sarah had not moved, and Murphy had looked at his youngest child asleep on this woman who was not yet his wife but was becoming everything necessary, and his face had done something private and complete that Clara saw from across the aisle and was glad for. The preacher was a small man with a large voice who had been performing ceremonies in Cedar Fork for 11 years and had developed the specific skill of saying exactly what a ceremony required without saying anything extra. He said the words. Daniel and Clara said theirs. When it was done, Daniel looked at her, not the way she had seen men look at new brides in the few weddings she had attended in her years of service, the performance of ownership, the public claiming. He looked at her the way he looked at everything he considered important, steadily, completely, with his full attention, and nothing held back. She looked back at him the same way. Outside, Cedar Fork was having an ordinary April morning. Wagon traffic on the main street. The general store opened its signs swinging in the light spring wind. The mountains above the valley still white at the peaks, but showing bare rock lower down the long, slow revelation of ground that had been waiting under snow since October. They drove back up the mountain in the late afternoon. The east room was framed. Daniel had spent the last 3 weeks on it during the hours between trapline and supper, working in the systematic, unhurried way that he worked at everything. The frame was sound. Clara could see that even without knowing the technical specifics. The joinery was the same quality as the original cabin, which was to say it was built to outlast the builder. The south window opening was cut and framed. She stood inside the skeleton of the new room on the afternoon they came home from Cedar Fork and looked out through the empty window frame at the mountain. The angle was exactly right. Not the view she would have imagined standing in St. Louis or in any of the households where she had spent her adult life wondering about the view from somewhere that was hers. It was better than imagined. It was specific, that particular mountain, those particular trees, the specific quality of late afternoon light filtering through spruce and pine and coming out the other side clear and cold and gold and entirely itself. Daniel came to stand beside her in the unfinished room. "You're looking at the angle," he said. "You got it right," she said. "You told me what you wanted." "I told you what I wanted," she agreed. "And you listened." He looked out the window frame. Down the slope to where the garden strip was already showing the first evidence of the work they had done, the soil turned, the rows marked the carrot seeds in and waiting. "The columbine goes in next week," he said, "if the temperature holds." "It'll hold." He looked at the sky through the unfinished roof joists. "Another 10 days of this and we're clear for the season." She looked at the garden and the mountain and the long light afternoon and the man standing beside her in a room that was not yet a room, but was already unmistakably theirs. "Daniel," she said. "Yes. I want to write more letters, after the legal business is settled. The Denver organization Margaret Daly asked if I would correspond regularly, about methods, about what women in difficult situations need to know in order to protect themselves." She paused. "I want to do that work." "I know you do," he said. "It will take time, evening time mostly, time that could be used for other things." "The evenings are long up here," he said. "There's enough time." She looked at him. "You'll help me when I need it." "I'll help you when you need it. And when I don't need it, you'll leave me to it." "When you don't need it," he said, "you won't know I'm in the room." She almost laughed. Not quite. But closed the specific thing that happened in her face when something surprised her into warmth before she could be deliberate about it. "You are always in the room," she said. "You are always in the room," he said. "That's the point." She looked back out the window. The mountain sat in the long slant of afternoon doing what it did enormous present permanent. Below it, Cedar Fork was a scatter of buildings and smoke, and the ordinary, ambitious noise of people arranging their lives. And here between the two, in a clearing that a man had cut out of the spruce timber 12 years ago for a woman who never arrived, a house stood with a new room taking shape at its east side, and in the garden in front of it, under turned soil, seeds were doing what seeds do in darkness, when no one is watching, waiting to become what they had always been going to be. That evening, Clara lit the lamp before supper. She had been doing this since February, a small automatic thing, the kind of thing you do in a place you have started to think of as home before you decide whether to call it that. Light the lamp, set the table, have the coffee ready. Daniel came in from the evening check and hung his coat and stopped. He was looking at the lamp on the table, the circle of warm light it threw across the room, the work table, the ledger, the shelf with the seeds, the 2 chairs, the stove, all of it within the lamp's reach. She set the supper out and they sat down and ate. After supper she wrote. He repaired a length of harness line. The stove burned its steady, measured burn. At some point in the middle of the evening she looked up and found him looking at her, not the evaluating look, not the assessing look. Something quieter than either of those, something that did not require categorization. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She went back to her letter. Later, when the lamp was burning low and the night had settled fully around the cabin, Clara went outside briefly to check the temperature to note the cloud cover for the morning entry. She stood on the step and looked up at the sky, which was clear and enormous and crowded with stars, the way high-altitude skies are crowded as if the stars have simply forgotten to leave space between themselves. She turned to go back inside. She stopped. From the outside through the window, the lamp threw its warm circle into the dark. Just a lamp on a table in a room. An ordinary domestic thing entirely unremarkable to anyone passing on the valley road far below who happened to look up and see the tiny point of light on the mountainside. But from here, standing on the step, it was not unremarkable. It was the most specific thing she had ever seen. A lamp lit in a room that had been dark for 12 years by a woman who had arrived on the wrong mountain in the wrong storm with the wrong name in a house built for someone who never came in a life that had been arranged entirely around the absence of exactly this. She stood in the cold for a moment and looked at it. Then she went inside. The garden came in strong that May. The carrots first, as she had predicted, small and certain, pushing up through the dark mountain soil in neat rows that followed the marks she had made with Daniel's measuring cord. The beans came after, slower, more deliberate. The leafy things she had not been sure would take at this altitude came in last and surprised her by coming in full. The columbine she had put in on an afternoon when the temperature held and the light was right, and Daniel had stood at the edge of the turned soil and watched her work without offering to help, understanding that some things needed to be done by the person doing them without assistance. She had put each one in at the right depth and the right spacing and covered them with care. They did not bloom that season. Perennials don't the first year. They spend the first year establishing roots going down into the soil, making themselves part of the place before they show what they are. She had expected that. She had planted them knowing that. In June, Elias came up with news from the territorial office. Arthur Voss had been formally charged. The inquiry had expanded into 3 territories. 7 women had come forward. Clara's original letters had been cited in 4 separate documents as the foundational testimony that had made the inquiry possible. He told them this sitting at the table with his coffee, looking slightly dazed, as if the scale of what had started from a piece of paper left on a trading post counter was still arriving to him in pieces. "Margaret Daly in Denver sent a letter," he said to Clara. "She wants to know if you'd consider coming to speak to the organization, women who are working on protective legislation." Clara looked at Daniel. "Denver," she said. "Denver," he confirmed. "Week's ride, give or take. In September, maybe, when the trap line doesn't need daily attention." "The near line can go 3 days without me," he said. "The far line can go 5. She looked at him. He looked back. "Then yes," she said to Elias. "Tell her yes." Elias looked between them with the expression of a man who has been waiting for years for 2 people to start making plans together and is now watching it happen and does not know where to put his hands. "All right," he said. "I'll tell her." He finished his coffee and went back down the mountain, and they watched him go until the tree line took him. There is one more thing to tell. On an evening in late summer when the days were finally long enough to push the dusk past 8 o'clock, and the mountain was in the particular phase that happens in August, when the high country is as warm as it ever gets, and the air has a quality to it that is impossible to describe to someone who has never been there, but that people who have been there never forget. On that kind of evening, Clara was in the new room. The room was finished. It had walls and a floor and the south-facing window with the afternoon light coming through it exactly as she had described it. The shelf was low and functional and held actual things. The hook beside the interior door was at 60 inches. She was writing at the small desk Daniel had built against the east wall. A good desk solid with a surface that did not wobble and a shelf above it for the things she needed within reach. She was writing a letter to Margaret Daly. Not about legal processes this time. About the harder thing, the thing that had no official form and required no witnesses, what it meant to be a woman trying to build something real in country that had not been designed with her in mind, and how you did it anyway and what you found when you did. Daniel was outside. She could hear him intermittently, the sound of the woodpile being extended along the east side of the cabin, work he did in the evenings when the trap line was done and the light was still good enough to work by. After a while the sound stopped. She looked up from the letter. She could see him through the south window. He had stopped working and was standing at the edge of the clearing looking up at the mountain above the tree line, the way he had always looked at it. The old look, the one that had existed before she arrived, the one that was his alone and not for anyone else. But he turned, not all the way, just slightly, toward the cabin, toward the window where the lamp was burning on her desk. She watched him turn toward the light the way you watch something you have been waiting for without knowing you were waiting for it. Then he bent back to the woodpile. She went back to her letter. The old-timers in Cedar Fork will tell you, if you find them on the right evening, that Daniel Grant came back to the living in the winter of 1884. They will tell you a woman arrived on his mountain by mistake and did not leave by choice. They will tell you this the way they tell the best stories, as if they were there, as if they know the inside of it. They don't know the inside of it. The inside of it was never dramatic. It did not happen all at once. It was not a declaration or a rescue or a transformation that announced itself. It was a lamp lit at the same time every evening. It was 2 people writing in the same ledger, their handwriting side by side on the same page. It was the sound of a creek finding its voice again in March, after 3 months of silence, and the smell of turned soil in May, and a woman planting columbine that would not bloom until next year, and a man measuring a window so the light would fall at the right angle for someone who was finally genuinely there. It was small. It was sufficient. The mountain kept its records the way it always had, in stone and snow and the slow, patient pressure of seasons. It had kept the record of a man who came up to it with a grief too large to live with anywhere smaller. It had kept him through 12 winters and 12 springs, and the long accumulated weight of all those days. And then it kept something else. A lamp in a window, lit every evening, still lit.